Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the smoke-filled alleys and deafening mills of the Industrial Revolution. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift through the crowded, soot-covered streets of 19th century cities, where progress wore a grim and exhausted face. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle historical journeys. And if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Let your breath deepen. Let the weight of your limbs sink into the mattress or the chair that supports you. Perhaps you are lying in the dark, a quiet hum outside your window, the soft ticking of a clock marking time. Or maybe the light of a nearby lamp casts golden shadows against the wall, dancing faintly as you ready your mind for rest. Let the world outside recede. Gently, let us retreat together into another world. When we think of the Industrial Revolution, we are often invited to admire a particular kind of story, one of achievement, triumph, innovation. Glowing accounts of factories rising like cathedrals, of railroads threading new continents, of power harnessed, wealth created, and humanity boldly stepping into a modern age. There is no shortage of pride in these retellings, the steam engine huffing like a giant heartbeat, the telegraph clicking across distances once thought uncrossable, the electric bulb blooming in the darkness. But this is not that story, or rather, it is not only that story. History, like the night, has its shadows. And what we were not told, what too often remains unspoken beneath the noise of progress, is the human cost. The deep, aching toll exacted on bodies, on families, on entire landscapes, the sleepless nights of factory children, the chapped hands of mothers working double shifts in damp cloth mills, the fathers whose lungs turned black before their 40th year, the rivers thick with chemicals, the air so dense with soot it stained skin and sky alike. This version of the Industrial Revolution does not dazzle. It does not sing of glory. Instead, it whispers truths that were left behind in the wake of machines. It tells of silence, the silence of those too tired to speak, too poor to protest, too indispensable to be noticed. So tonight, as the world outside slows and softens, we turn toward those silences. Imagine the year is 1842. Somewhere in the heart of England, beneath a leaden sky, smoke is rising. Not from a single chimney, but from dozens, hundreds, stretching across the town like blackened fingers grasping upward. The streets are slick with coal dust. The alleys are crowded with children, most of them thin, some barefoot even in the cold. The clamor of machinery hums through the brick walls, a constant metallic rhythm that never truly stops, not even in the small hours of the morning. This was the rhythm of progress. This was the drumbeat of empire. But who kept the rhythm alive? Whose fingers turned the spindles? Whose backs bent beneath the looms? And what did they lose in the process? Tonight, we will travel through the forgotten corners of the industrial age, not just in England, but in Scotland, in Wales, in the northern towns of France, in the coal-rich valleys of Germany, in the sweat-soaked factories of the early United States. This is a global story, rooted in the shared experience of labor, fatigue, survival, and resilience. A story not told through inventions, but through endurance. We begin with a simple truth. Progress, as we know it, was not equally shared. While a few climbed ladders made of iron and steam, many more remained at the bottom, bruised and breathing the fumes. Tonight, let us pause at the threshold of this history, not to judge, but to see. not to indict, but to understand. What we call modern life is built, in no small part, on this foundation. The rhythm of factories still echoes in our modern routines. The pressure of time, the craving for productivity, the silence around suffering, they are not new. They are old. They are inherited. So close your eyes, if you'd like. Let the imagined sound of distant engines fade into a hush. Let your body settle. This journey is not one of rushing, but of resting. We will walk slowly. We will listen deeply. And perhaps, in the quiet company of those who came before, you will find a kind of comfort. Not in the brightness of progress, but in the quiet truth that suffering was seen and now remembered. You are not alone. Many in many times have felt what you feel now. As you continue to drift gently into stillness, we now step into the narrow doorway of a textile mill in the north of England. It is still dark outside, perhaps 5 o'clock in the morning. The streets are nearly silent, save for the muffled shuffle of small footsteps, barefoot or wrapped in rags, echoing faintly against cobblestones slick with dew and soot. These are not the hurried feet of early workers, nor the shouts of men. They are the quieter, unhurried, obedient footsteps of children. Children rising not for school, not for games or chores, but for another long day inside the mill. This is not a dramatic fiction, but a daily truth for thousands across Europe and the emerging industrial world in the 19th century. Children as young as 6, sometimes even 5, were awakened while the stars still hung in the sky, pulled from the warmth of straw beds to dress in coarse garments, to swallow cold porridge or stale bread, and to be guided, often by older siblings or weary mothers, to the gates of the factory. Inside, the air was thick and warm, heavy with moisture and the scent of cotton fibers, oil, and dust. The machines dominated every inch of space. Rows of looms and spinning frames clattered and thudded without rest. The noise was constant, deafening, swallowing any attempts at conversation. The children worked not far from the adult workers, but beside them, though their pay was a mere fraction and their tasks often more perilous. Their small fingers and lithe frames were seen as an advantage, allowing them to crawl beneath machinery, to clean, to reach what others could not. But this came at a cost. The hours were punishing, often 12 to 14 each day, 6 days a week. In some cases, factories ran shifts around the clock, and children rotated in and out of dormitories built into the factory complex itself. There was no break for school. There was little room for play. Laughter, when it happened, was brief and hushed, an accidental luxury in an environment that valued obedience and silence above all. Poverty made resistance impossible. Entire families depended on the pennies these children brought home. And so, when a child stumbled from exhaustion, there was no relief. When a finger was mangled in the machinery, there was no compensation. When a child cried, it was often met not with comfort, but with punishment. Overseers patrolled the mill floors with leather straps and sticks, issuing blows to those who slowed or faltered. Older children were sometimes placed in charge of the younger ones, creating a harsh hierarchy of fear and submission. Sleepiness was treated as defiance, injury as inconvenience. The consequences of such labor were written directly onto the bodies of these children. Stunted growth, curved spines, distorted joints, eyes strained from poor light, lungs blackened by dust. And perhaps more lasting still, the dulling of joy, of curiosity, of the spirit itself. And yet, the mills were only part of the story. In the coal mines of Wales and northern England, children served as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in near total darkness for 10 or 12 hours a day. Others pulled coal carts through narrow tunnels, their small bodies harnessed like animals. In glassworks, in matchstick factories, in brickworks, in shipyards, the story repeated itself. Long hours, dangerous tasks, tiny hands expected to do the labor of grown men, and all of it under the justification of necessity. Factory owners defended the practice, citing poverty, efficiency, and even morality. Some claimed that hard work built character. Others insisted that children would starve without this employment, and for many, the profits that flowed from those little hands simply mattered more than the lives behind them. There were voices who objected: reformers, clergy, doctors. Writers, they documented, they protested, they called for laws. But change came slowly, too slowly for so many. Legislation passed, then stalled. Rules were made, but poorly enforced. Inspectors were few and easily bribed. And for every child removed from a factory floor, another waited to take their place. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Imagine for a moment the small hand of a child resting on a loom, steadying the thread as the shuttle flies past. Imagine the weight of a day that began before the sun rose, with no promise of rest until it set again. Imagine a world where such days stretched on, unbroken, for years. It is tempting to think of this as something far away, sealed in the past. But echoes of this still exist. In corners of the modern world, children still labor for survival, their lives shaped by the same logic, that profit justifies pain, that silence is easier than reform. Tonight, we remember those silent hands. We see them in the flickering shadows of factory walls, moving steadily, tirelessly, often invisibly. Their stories were seldom recorded, their names mostly lost. But their labor built cities, fueled empires, wove the fabric of the industrial age, thread by thread, shift by shift, hour by hour. Let this story be a whisper against forgetting, a soft breath of recognition, long overdue. And as you rest now, in a quieter time, know that rest itself is a privilege once denied to many. To children who deserved far more than they received, let us carry them with us into the next part of the story. As your body finds its rhythm in the stillness of the night, we leave behind the mechanical roar of the factories and enter a different silence, a deeper, older, more solemn quiet. This is not the silence of overworked children too tired to cry, nor of mothers swallowing pain to endure another shift. This is the silence of the soil, of time layered upon time, of memories buried not in words or ledgers, but in the bones of the forgotten. Imagine a stretch of earth, perhaps behind what is now a modern building, or beneath the crumbling outline of a long-abandoned church. There is little to suggest what lies beneath, just grass or stone, or the hum of modern life passing overhead. But beneath that ground, beneath the roots and rubble, there is a story waiting to be told, not in ink, but in calcium, cartilage, and marrow. This is where bioarchaeology begins. In the shadows of modern cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Liverpool, archaeologists have uncovered mass graves and burial grounds from the 18th and 19th centuries. The remains they find are not of aristocrats or landowners. These are not the tombs of inventors or industrialists. These are the graves of the poor, the overworked, the anonymous many who powered the Industrial Revolution with their bodies, and among them, tragically often, are the bones of children. Their small frames lie folded in wooden coffins, long since rotted away. In many cases, they were buried without names, without dates, without ceremony. But their bones have survived, and in their silence, they speak volumes. Consider the remains of a girl, perhaps 9 years old, unearthed in the north of England. Her skull shows signs of anemia, likely from a diet, low in iron and nutrients. Her legs are bowed, a clear sign of rickets, caused by chronic vitamin D deficiency, a result of little exposure to sunlight, typical of children who spent nearly every daylight hour inside factories. Her spine is curved, her knees misaligned. She died young, as many did. Her growth was stunted, her life compressed. Or imagine a boy aged 12 at death, found near an old mill site. His arms are disproportionately developed, his right arm thicker, more muscular than the left. This is the result of repetitive, one-sided labor, likely in a textile factory where he would have been tasked with turning a crank or handling heavy spools of cotton. The vertebrae in his neck are compressed. There are signs of healed fractures in his ribs. He had fallen, perhaps more than once, and kept working afterward. These are not isolated cases. Across Britain and into continental Europe, the skeletal record tells a collective story, one of malnutrition, chronic overwork, physical trauma, and arrested development. And these physical markers do not appear in wealthy children of the same time. The evidence is clear. Poverty shaped the body, labor shaped the bones. Inequality was not just felt, it was carved into the very structure of those who lived it. The skulls of these children often show signs of cribra orbitalia, small lesions behind the eyes caused by nutritional deficiency. Their long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri, show growth lines, disruptions in development during periods of extreme stress. These are scars of hunger, of cold winters, of infections left untreated. In many, teeth are missing, decayed, or never fully formed. In others, spines are twisted unnaturally, or knees are bent in permanent crouch-like postures from years of labor-intensive positioning. And in women, especially those who bore children young, while still adolescents themselves, the pelvis often tells a harrowing story of pregnancies too early and too frequent. In some, signs of past trauma or injury from childbirth are evident. The body records what society tried to forget. These remains are sometimes found in layered graves, 3-4 bodies deep, stacked by necessity, by poverty, by the pressures of overcrowded urban cemeteries. The bodies were not laid to rest with dignity, but with efficiency, quick burials, few mourners, no gravestones. Yet centuries later, when these graves are opened by careful hands and studied by compassionate eyes, the truth of their lives begins to surface. In this way, bioarchaeology becomes an act of historical justice, a quiet restoration of dignity to lives that were dismissed, ignored, or simply erased. The laboratory becomes a kind of temple. The microscope, a lens not of cold science, but of reverence. The measurements and observations speak for those who could not. Modern researchers do not simply catalog these remains. They read them like fragile letters from the past. They analyze bone density, study patterns of wear, scan for signs of repetitive motion, of chemical exposure, of physical trauma. And slowly, delicately, they reconstruct a life, not in full, never in detail, but with enough tenderness to glimpse the humanity that once moved inside those bones. And what emerges from all this study is not just sorrow. There is resilience here, too. Bodies that endured years of suffering. Skeletons that tell us someone lived, fought illness, worked, perhaps loved. There is testimony, not just of pain, but of strength. A strength that was never acknowledged in its own time, but that we can honor now, in the quiet of this night. Let your breathing slow. Let your body, alive and whole, rest gently, and consider the dignity of memory. These children, these workers, were never meant to be remembered. They were treated as expendable, their value measured in productivity, not in humanity. But now, centuries later, they are seen, not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with care. Their bones, at last, are heard. and so we carry them forward. From the quiet of the grave to the quiet of the heart, they remain with us, not in tragedy alone, but in remembrance, in truth, in the whisper of stories once buried, now softly told. As your breath settles into a deeper rhythm and the world outside fades to shadows, let us move now through narrow streets, winding and grimy, hemmed in by soot-streaked brick buildings that rise without grace. These are the arteries of the new industrial city. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Glasgow. Once modest market towns, they swelled almost overnight into sprawling, restless hives of labor, noise, and smoke. By the early decades of the 19th century, the countryside was emptying, and the cities were overflowing. Imagine the shift in landscape. Where once green fields stretched under open skies, chimneys now speared upward in clusters, exhaling smoke day and night. Rows of houses, hastily constructed, pressed together like teeth in a clenched jaw. The streets between them narrowed, paved with cobblestone or not paved at all, just dirt and waste and water that did not drain. The rush to industrialize brought people faster than infrastructure could bear, and the result was a kind of organized chaos. A place where survival outpaced comfort and growth outpaced care. Thousands arrived weekly, families from the countryside fleeing agricultural decline, workers from Ireland escaping famine, migrants from across Britain drawn by the promise of wages. They came with hope. But the cities had little to give them beyond shelter in the most literal sense. 4 walls, a roof, often shared with strangers, sometimes with animals, always with damp and filth. These were not homes. They were dwellings of necessity. In the heart of these cities rose the back-to-backs, narrow houses built wall to wall, room behind room, each space subdivided to its limit. A single building might contain a dozen families. Privacy was a luxury no one expected. Entire households, parents, children, perhaps even boarders, might sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed. Human breath thickened the air. Lice crawled beneath bedding. Chamber pots sat full in corners. The smell of unwashed bodies, wet clothing, coal smoke, spoiled food, all of it combined into a constant, inescapable fog. There was no sewerage, at least not for the poor. Human waste was collected in cesspits that overflowed in rain. Rats were ever present. And water, when it could be found, was often drawn from the same sources into which waste had seeped. In the worst neighborhoods, it was common for families to draw water from shallow wells dug near latrines. Contamination was constant. Disease, inevitable. Epidemics swept through these environments like fire through dry straw. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These names became as familiar as street names, as neighbors. A child might be born in a crowded room, only to die within months from tainted milk, from polluted air, from the simple act of breathing in such proximity to so many others. Infants perished in beds beside their siblings. Mothers mourned and worked in the same breath. These cities were hungry. They consumed lives, labor, time, health. The factories demanded more workers, and the landlords demanded more rent. There was no space for grief, only motion. Streets remained crowded long after sundown. Work shifts staggered. Footsteps echoed into the night. Even sleep, when it came, was light, broken by the cries of a sick child, the drip of a leaking roof, the scurry of vermin beneath floorboards. And yet people stayed. They endured. Because as harsh as the cities were, the alternative was often worse. Starvation in the countryside, rejection from the workhouse. There was no going back, only forward, through the filth, through the fog, into another day. City planning, if it could be called that, focused on industry first. Railroads sliced through communities. Factory compounds expanded unchecked. Smoke was not regulated, Waste was not managed. Parks and clean streets were built, yes, but for the wealthy. The working poor remained packed into slums, invisible to policy and power, visible only in their labor. Observers from the time, writers, doctors, even the occasional politician, took note. Friedrich Engels, writing from Manchester, described the working-class quarters in vivid, sorrowful detail. The collapsing buildings, the stench, the sickness. Others echoed his reports, but change was slow, too slow for most. Urbanization during the Industrial Revolution was not just a demographic event. It was an act of reshaping human life, how people lived, how they died, how they related to one another, to space, to time. It altered everything: birth, death, work, illness, rest, and all of it unfolded in the shadows of those rising smokestacks beneath skies that rarely cleared. Pause here, if you will. Let the image of those crowded streets soften in your mind. Feel the weight of too many bodies in too small a space. The sound of coughing in the night. The creak of wooden floorboards holding more life than they were ever meant to. This was not the glamour of progress. This was its underbelly. This was the city that swallowed. And still, behind every window, behind every brick, there were lives lived fully, laughter, however brief, love, however fragile, resistance, however quiet. We remember them now, not as victims of history, but as part of it, as those whose ordinary, difficult days shaped the world we know. Let their memory settle beside you as the night deepens. Let the distant noise of a crowded, forgotten street fade into the background of your rest. There is more to see, more to feel. But for now, just listen to the quiet that remains. Settle further now, deeper into the hush of this long night. Let your mind soften its grip on the present and allow your senses to drift into a sky that once darkened, not with the fall of evening, but with the rise of industry. A sky not shaded by twilight, but blackened by soot, by smoke, by the unrelenting breath of machines. In the industrial towns of the 19th century, the very air became a laborer, worked, strained, choked. Every puff of a factory chimney, every cartload of coal shoveled into a furnace added to the invisible burden that wrapped itself around the lungs of those who lived below. And they did live below, underneath the smoke, within the shadows, breathing what the machines exhaled. Coal was the fuel of the revolution. It was black gold, abundant and powerful, and it drove the engines of progress. But it also released clouds of fine soot, sulfur, and heavy metals into the atmosphere. The smell was acrid. The taste lingered on the tongue. The fog that rolled through towns was not simply mist. It was a toxic blend of particles, drifting through every open window, settling on every surface, invading every breath. Imagine walking to work in such a place, say, in the heart of Birmingham, often called the City of 1,000 Trades. You step into the morning not with the freshness of dew, but into air that is already thick, already warm, already burned. Your clothing carries the scent of smoke, your skin becomes coated with a fine black dust, and even your eyelashes collect grime by day's end. The sun, when it is visible, is pale and distant, veiled behind layers of chemical haze. This was not rare. This was daily life. Respiratory illnesses were rampant. Chronic bronchitis, often referred to as miner's lung or factory cough, afflicted workers and their children alike. Tuberculosis thrived in these conditions, passed easily in cramped homes, encouraged by dampness and polluted air. Even those who never entered a factory could feel the weight of industry pressing into their chests. There was no escape indoors. Homes were poorly insulated, walls breathed in the same soot. Coal stoves used for cooking and heating added their own emissions to the mix. burning through long winters, especially in tenements where multiple families shared a single room. Infants coughed through their earliest nights. The elderly wheezed beside the hearth. The healthy were few and far between. Medical records from the time reveal a harrowing truth. Life expectancy in many industrial cities fell as progress rose. In parts of Manchester, for example, the average lifespan for a working-class man hovered around 35 years. For women, slightly longer, but often interrupted by childbirth, illness, or both. Children rarely saw their 5th birthday, not because of war, not because of famine, but because the very air they breathed was slowly eroding their lungs, their resistance, their futures. And yet, this toll was hidden in plain sight. The smoke became part of the landscape, expected, accepted, even admired by some as a symbol of power and productivity. Painters captured the skyline of factory towns, framing the thick plumes of smoke as a kind of industrial sublime. Writers described the energy of cities without acknowledging the haze that dulled their colors. Politicians celebrated growth, blind to the breathless bodies beneath their rhetoric. No regulations governed emissions in those early decades. No laws limited what could be released into the sky. The atmosphere was seen as infinite, immune, a dumping ground without consequence. And so every advancement in production brought with it an invisible tax, a quiet, deadly haze that thickened year by year. Not all suffered equally. The wealthy, when possible, retreated to the cleaner air of the countryside or to neighborhoods perched above the industrial basin. They breathed easier. Their children played beneath bluer skies. But for the majority, there was no such reprieve. They lived where they worked, and they worked where the air was thickest. Listen closely. In the silence now, can you hear it? The deep, slow coughing of a laborer, the short, panicked gasps of a child, the whisper of wind through soot-covered trees. These are the sounds the factories drowned out. These are the voices the smoke obscured. But the damage did not vanish when the smoke dispersed. It settled. It stayed. In lungs, in water, in the very bones of the dead. Some studies today, examining sediment layers in riverbeds near old factory towns, still find traces of 19th century pollutants, mercury, lead, coal ash, quiet reminders of a past that did not fully pass. Progress, it seems, had a scent, and it clung to everything. As you breathe now, clean air filling your lungs gently, remember those who could not, whose every breath was a burden, whose days were measured not in hours, but in how long they could stand the burning in their chest. Their story is not one of innovation, but of endurance, not of triumph, but of survival in spite of the air itself. And so we continue with a softened heart into the next layer of this shared history. Let the haze lift gently. Let the silence fall. There is more to hear, more to feel, and more to remember. As the night folds in more quietly around you, we turn from the choking skies of industry to the slow-moving rivers that once promised life. But these rivers, too, were changed, transformed not into lifelines, but into long, dark wounds flowing through the heart of every industrial town. Their waters, once sources of nourishment, reflection, and renewal, became veins of poison. Imagine standing on the banks of the River Irwell in Manchester, or the Clyde in Glasgow, or the Thames as it winds through the rapidly industrializing boroughs of London. What you see is not the gentle glint of sunlight on a clean current, but something darker. The water is thick, sluggish, sometimes black, sometimes gray, its surface oily, its smell unmistakable. It stings the nostrils, it curls in the throat. It does not welcome you, it repels. These rivers carried more than water. They carried waste, tons of it, poured directly from factory outflows, from slaughterhouses, dye works, tanneries, and homes. Human waste mingled with industrial byproducts. The colors of textiles bled into the currents, staining entire stretches in hues of blue, red, and yellow. Sludge thickened their bottoms. Fish disappeared. Frogs and birds went silent. And still, the rivers were used. They were used for washing clothes, for drawing water to drink, to cook, to clean. Children played at the edges, barefoot, unknowing. Women came to rinse linens, their arms submerged in toxic mixtures of chemicals and filth. Families living in overcrowded housing had no alternatives. Wells were often contaminated. Clean water was a privilege of the few. For the many, the river, however foul, was all they had. The consequences came quickly. Cholera erupted again and again like a curse that could not be broken. In 1832, London saw a wave of death so severe that panic swept the city, and still officials resisted action. The belief then was that disease spread through foul smells, not contaminated water. So long as the stench was tolerated, the cause was overlooked. It wasn't until the Great Stink of 1858, when the heat of summer intensified the odor of the Thames to unbearable levels, even for Parliament, that real change was considered. But long before that moment, long before engineers were commissioned and sanitation reforms discussed, generations had suffered quietly. Infants lost to diarrhea, elders taken by typhoid. The water they drank had betrayed them again and again. The smaller rivers, too, told the same story. In Leeds, in Sheffield, in Nottingham, streams that once watered crops and provided fish were reduced to open sewers. In some towns, there were so many chemicals in the water that it caught fire. In others, the very ground around the riverbanks turned toxic. Plants withered, trees died, the earth remembered. And yet, as with the air, the suffering was uneven. Those who lived closest to the rivers, those whose homes clung to the edges of the industrial zones, bore the heaviest cost. These were the workers, the newly arrived migrants, the widows and children left behind. For them, pollution was not a future concern or a matter of legislation. It was immediate. It was personal. The industrialists defended the practice. They argued necessity, progress, output. To treat waste was expensive, and they saw no profit in prevention. Nature, they believed, could absorb anything. And so they poured in more dyes, lead, acids, animal remains. And the rivers kept moving, slower now, darker now, heavier with each passing year. Contemporary observers wrote of the rivers with horror. Some compared them to open wounds. Others described the stillness of their flow as death-like. But again, these words changed little. What mattered in the eyes of industry was production. The rest, health, dignity, beauty, was disposable. And so the rivers bore witness, quietly, relentlessly. They carried the refuse of human ambition. They mourned in silence. Now, as you lie still in the quiet of your own night, picture those waters once more, not in judgment, but in mourning. Picture the mother washing clothes beside a poisoned stream, the child scooping water into a tin cup. The laborer rinsing his soot-covered hands in currents thick with dye. They did not know the full extent of the danger, but they felt its weight, in the fever that followed, in the stillborn child, in the persistent cough that never quite faded. Let the sound of water, even now, soothe you, not the tainted current of history, but the imagined flow of what could have been, clean, cool, restorative. This is not simply the story of rivers ruined. It is the story of care neglected, of consequences delayed, of lives devalued. And as we drift forward into the next chapter, the memory of those dark waters follows, not to haunt, but to honor. For every river once darkened, there was a child who watched its surface ripple with something close to hope. Let that hope remain. Let it flow forward, quietly, gently, endlessly. As you drift further into quietude, we turn now to the beating heart of the factory, not the gears, nor the belts, nor the endless spools of raw material being spun into cloth or metal, but the people, the men, women, and children, whose bodies were pulled into rhythm with the machines, whose time, once measured by sunlight and season, became regulated by bells, whistles, and the ticking of clocks. This is the story of how the human spirit, once connected to craft and creation, was drawn into the cold embrace of mechanized routine. It is a story of alienation, subtle, enduring, and profound. Before the machines, there was the artisan, the weaver in her cottage, turning threads by hand, the shoemaker crafting each pair with care, the blacksmith shaping iron by feel, by instinct. Work was not easy, but it carried a sense of continuity, of identity. A task completed was a task understood. A product bore the mark of the maker. There was time, however little, for thought, for decision, for rest. But as the Industrial Revolution surged forward, that rhythm was shattered. Now imagine stepping into a textile mill at dawn. The air is already loud, thick with the constant clatter of machinery. Rows of looms stretch endlessly, all moving in unison, powered by a single force: steam, water, or coal. Each worker is assigned a station. They do not move freely. Their task is singular, repetitive, one motion, one role, all day, every day. A man might stand for 14 hours replacing broken threads. He does not weave. He does not design. He only replaces the broken. His eyes must stay focused. His hands must not hesitate. The machine does not wait. If he misses a beat, production slows. If he speaks, he risks reprimand. If he dreams, he risks injury. This is not work as it once was. This is labor stripped of creation, of control. It is labor reduced to movement. The term alienation would come later through philosophers and observers trying to give name to this quiet erosion of the self. But the workers felt it then, long before it had language. They felt it in the ache of their bodies, not from effort, but from stillness within motion, from repeating the same gesture hundreds, thousands of times, from producing something they would never use, never own, never recognize. Women worked the same shifts, often for less pay. Their roles were no less grueling, feeding fabric into machines, trimming, inspecting. They stood in long rows, sometimes with infants beside them in baskets, sleeping through the noise until they didn't. Mothers who had once passed down skills from generation to generation were now cogs themselves, replaceable, watched. Children, too, became part of this rhythm. Their small bodies were suited to tasks that required crawling beneath moving machines or reaching into narrow spaces. They did not play. They did not learn. They adapted to the factory as one adapts to a storm, quietly, without choice. There was no sense of ownership. The factory belonged to the mill owner, the machine too. Even time no longer belonged to the worker. Days were sliced into shifts, each minute accounted for. To arrive late was a punishable offense. To stop early was unthinkable. A man might work a decade in the same factory and never see the inside of the office, never speak directly to the owner, never be known by name. This was the transformation, not only of cities and machines, but of people. The factory imposed a new way of being, linear, rigid, depersonalized. It demanded obedience, regularity, speed, and in exchange it offered just enough wages to survive, never enough to rest. The weekends were short, the evenings were brief. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by pain, worry, noise. This alienation extended beyond the factory walls. In time, It seeped into the home, into relationships, into the way people saw themselves. Workers were no longer defined by what they made, but by how many hours they worked. Pride gave way to endurance, craft to compliance. Hands, once skilled and varied, became instruments of singular motion, and yet beneath all this, something human remained. Workers found ways to resist the hollowing. Some sang quietly above the drone of machines, some told stories on their breaks, some looked for small ways to break monotony, adjusting a task, helping a neighbor, imagining a different life. These were not revolutions. They were flickers of identity, gentle acts of remembrance, that they were not only hands, that they were minds, that they were hearts. Let yourself rest with this thought. The machine changed the world, but it did not completely erase the worker. Even in the darkest, most mechanical hours, humanity persisted, in glances exchanged, in small moments of rebellion, in the silent yearning for meaning. This yearning remains. And as we continue our journey through the shadows of the past, we carry with us the weight of this alienation, not to grieve endlessly, but to remember gently, to understand that the progress we celebrate was also a process of loss, a loss of autonomy, of connection, of soul. And even now, in quieter places, that memory lingers, in the quiet hum of modern devices, in the monotony of certain days, in the question that still rises, what is the cost of efficiency? Let the night hold you. Let the question float. We will continue soon, always gently, always together. As the night presses more deeply around you and your breath slows to a near whisper, we move now into a chapter where silence and sound collided, not in the clatter of the machines, but in the echo of hammers meeting iron, of wood splintering under the weight of desperation. This is a moment in history when quiet workers, long enduring, suddenly rose, not with words, but with force, the Luddites. Their name lingers, often misunderstood, yet their pain was as clear as soot in the sky. The setting is England, the early years of the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars are drawing resources and attention abroad. At home, prices for bread soar, jobs vanish. The harvests have failed. The rural poor, already strained, find themselves now at the mercy of an economy shifting under their feet. In the weaving cottages of Nottinghamshire and the wool towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire, skilled artisans, frame knitters, croppers, hand loom weavers watch helplessly as the value of their work evaporates. For generations, these craftspeople had shaped their own labor. A cloth finisher, for instance, might have spent years perfecting his technique, passing it to his sons, ensuring that each roll of wool that left his table bore not just quality, but pride. The rhythm of his day was not set by a clock, but by the thread, the loom, the pace of hands that knew their task intimately. His dignity was woven into each length of cloth. But with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, these rhythms broke. Factory owners, hungry for speed and scale, turned to new technologies. Machines like the gig mill, the shearing frame, and the power loom could do in minutes what skilled hands once did in hours. But these machines required no mastery, only repetition. They were operated by cheaper labor, women, children, the untrained poor. Wages fell. Demand for craftsmanship plummeted. The old trades, once respected, became obsolete almost overnight. The artisans pleaded. They sent petitions to Parliament. They gathered in public squares. They argued for regulation, for minimum wages, for the right to retain their trades. But their voices faded into the greater noise of industrial ambition. Machinery, they were told, was the future. Adapt or vanish. And so, in the winter of 1811 in the small town of Arnold, Nottinghamshire, the first machines were destroyed. It began slowly. A few knitting frames smashed in the dead of night. A factory window shattered. An overseer threatened. The acts were quiet, anonymous, but they spread. Soon across Yorkshire and Lancashire, wool mills were targeted, cropping machines were broken. The destruction was methodical, deliberate. The attackers often left no other damage, only the machine itself dismantled, burned, rendered silent. They called themselves Luddites. The name came from a legend. Ned Ludd, a figure both mythical and real, was said to be a young apprentice who, mistreated by his employer, once broke his machinery in rage. Whether he truly lived mattered little. He became a symbol, a folk hero. Letters from the rebels were signed in his name: General Ludd, Captain Ludd, King Ludd. Yasol. And though the men behind the masks were real, miners, weavers, laborers, their actions took on a larger meaning. They were not merely breaking machines. They were resisting a future that had no place for them. The government responded with terror. By 1812, machine breaking had been declared a capital offense. Hundreds of troops were dispatched to the industrial north, not to fight foreign armies, but to guard machinery from English hands. Entire towns were placed under surveillance. Spies were hired, rewards were offered, and when Luddites were caught, they were made into examples: public hangings, mass trials, transportation to penal colonies. Still, the movement did not stop immediately. In some places, it even intensified. There were confrontations, riots, gunfire. But by 1816, the rebellion had largely been crushed. The mills kept running, the machines kept humming. And the Luddites, those who had not died or vanished or been exiled, returned to lives even harder than before. And yet, their story endured. History would later mock them. Luddite became a slur, a word for someone stubborn, resistant, irrational. But this was never true. The Luddites were not ignorant of machines. Many were highly skilled. They did not hate innovation. They hated exploitation. They feared a world in which workers were discarded like worn-out parts, where labor had no voice, no dignity, no future. They saw clearly what many refused to see: that technology, when driven by profit alone, could become a weapon. Pause now and imagine the sound of a loom crashing to the floor, the way the walls of a factory echoed with the shatter, the footsteps fleeing into the fog, the hands that swung the hammer, not in malice but in mourning, because this was grief. Grief for lost work, lost meaning, lost self. Tonight, in your quiet, remember the Luddites not as enemies of progress, but as its first casualties. Remember them not for their hammers, but for their hands, hands that once crafted cloth with care, with patience, with pride, hands that knew what it was to shape something from nothing, and then to be told that such knowledge no longer mattered. Let their silence settle beside you, a gentle presence in the darkness. And let us continue slowly with their memory walking beside us. There are still many voices to hear, many stories to unfold, and always, always more humanity to remember. As the quiet of the night deepens and your thoughts begin to drift more freely, we enter a space often overlooked in histories of labor and machinery, the factory floor as inhabited by women. Here, in the soot-shadowed rooms of spinning mills, in the sweat-slicked corridors of textile workshops, women labored not as exceptions, but as essentials. Their presence was constant, their work relentless, their fatigue immeasurable. Yet they were seldom honored, seldom protected, and rarely heard. It is easy to imagine the Industrial Revolution as a world of men, engineers, factory owners, miners, machinists. But this picture leaves out nearly half the story. For while steam powered the engines and coal fed the furnaces, it was often women, thousands upon thousands, who fed the looms, trimmed the threads, and kept the machines moving hour after hour. From the earliest days of industrialization, women were a sought-after labor force. They were paid less than men, they were considered more obedient, and they were thought to have smaller, more delicate hands, ideal for the intricate, repetitive tasks that machines demanded. In the cotton mills of Manchester, in the wool factories of Leeds, in the silk workshops of Lyon, in the matchstick plants of London, women were everywhere. Their work was invisible only to those who chose not to see. Imagine, if you will, the sound of hundreds of spindles spinning at once, the floor trembling slightly under the rhythm. Picture long rows of women, some barely more than girls, standing side by side, each focused intently on her task. There is no room to stretch. The air is thick, warm, sometimes unbearably humid. Fibers cling to clothing, to skin, to hair. The noise is so great that speech is nearly impossible. They communicate with glances, with gestures, with the quiet language of those who share the same burden. Their shifts often lasted 12 to 14 hours. Breaks were rare. Some stood the entire time. Others moved constantly from one end of the machine to the other. The work was not only tiring, it was dangerous. Hair could be caught in gears. Fingers could be sliced by blades or crushed in rollers. Fatigue made mistakes more likely, and mistakes could mean injury or dismissal. And then, when the shift ended, another began, not in the factory, but at home. Unlike their male counterparts, most working women did not return to rest. They returned to labor of a different kind: cooking, cleaning, washing, caring for children. The domestic workload did not disappear when industrial labor began. It merely layered atop it, forming what we now understand as the double burden. Their exhaustion was never complete, never acknowledged, never tended to. Many were mothers. Some brought their infants to the factory floor, laying them in cradles beneath the machines. Others left children at home with older siblings, hoping the day would pass without illness or accident. The separation was not emotional, but economic. To survive, they had to work. To work, they had to leave. Others were daughters, sisters, widows, women who had no husband to support them or who refused to depend on one. They entered factories because there was no alternative. And often they remained for years, their youth worn down by labor, their hopes narrowed by necessity. And there was more. Harassment was commonplace, yet unspoken. Male overseers held power not only over employment, but over dignity. A woman could be dismissed for refusing an advance, for complaining of discomfort, for becoming pregnant. There were no protections, no channels for protest. Silence again became survival. Still, women endured. They formed bonds with one another, quiet sisterhoods born of shared hardship. They helped one another, covered for one another, shared food, stories, warnings. In some cases, they organized strikes, walked out of mills, formed unions. Their resistance was often quiet, often crushed, but never absent. They were not passive figures in history. They were the pulse of the factory, the breath behind the steam. And yet, their stories were often written out of the record. Statistics counted them, payrolls listed them. But the fullness of their lives, their strength, their sacrifices, their inner worlds, was lost to time. Tonight we pause for them, not as an act of pity, but of recognition. The woman standing beside the loom, the girl carrying bobbins across a dusty floor, the mother rising before dawn to prepare tea and bread before her shift. These are not background figures. They are the heart of the industrial age. Let their presence accompany you now, softly. Let their fatigue settle into understanding, not weight. Let the sound of their footsteps, quiet and steady, walk with us into the next chamber of this long night. They were many. They were strong. And though their names may be lost, Their work remains woven into the fabric of the world we still inhabit. Let the darkness wrap gently around you now, for where we are going, light is scarce. In this next chapter of our long, quiet journey through the industrial past, we descend slowly, steadily, into the depths of the earth, into the shafts and tunnels of the coal mines. Into places where day never enters, where the air is thick, damp, and heavy with silence, broken only by the creak of wood, the clink of pickaxes, the occasional shout that echoes and disappears. The coal mine was one of the most dangerous and grueling environments of the industrial world, yet it was also one of the most essential. Coal fed the furnaces, powered the steam engines, heated homes, lit factories. The entire machine of industry depended on it. And that coal had to be pulled from the ground, ton by ton, shift by shift, by human hands, many of them calloused, small, and trembling. Miners did not walk into work, they descended into it. Deep shafts were carved through rock, then supported by wooden beams that groaned under pressure. Ladders stretched downward, carts were lowered. In some mines, lifts were powered by hand or horse. Others relied on primitive steam engines. At the bottom, narrow tunnels radiated outward, like the spokes of a wheel, lit only by flickering lamps hung from hats or carried by hand. The air was stale, the walls close. The deeper you went, the more the earth seemed to breathe against your skin. In these mines, men, women, and children worked side by side. Though their tasks differed, their hardships did not. Men, often in their prime or already weathered by years of labor, wielded picks and hammers, breaking rock and loosening seams of coal. The work was slow, repetitive, brutal. Backs bent for hours, hands blistered, muscles strained, dust filled every breath. There was no fresh air, only the hot, damp exhale of the earth. Women, when employed underground, performed hauling work, dragging carts filled with coal along tracks or ropes. In some regions, they were known as putters or hurriers. Bent at the waist, sometimes crawling, they pulled heavy loads through passages too narrow for standing. The carts were made of iron or wood, often with wheels that jammed or tracks that broke. And when the path became too steep, the women pushed instead, backs to the cart, feet slipping in the mud. But perhaps most haunting of all were the children. Some were as young as 5 or 6. They worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark to open and close ventilation doors, crucial for keeping airflow stable, but isolating. These children waited in total blackness for the sound of approaching carts, then pulled a rope to open a wooden door, then waited again. Hours passed this way. No light, no movement. Only the occasional rat, the drip of water, the sound of distant footsteps. Others hauled coal alongside the women. They were harnessed with belts and chains, crawling through the lowest tunnels, their knees raw from stone and grit. Breaks were rare. Injuries were common. A fall of rock could bury a child. A misstep could crush a hand, and yet they returned day after day. Because their families depended on every penny, because there was no other choice. The danger was not only physical. The air carried invisible threats, coal dust that blackened lungs, leading to chronic cough to suffocation. Methane gas, which could ignite without warning, turning the mine into a firestorm. And then there were the collapses, the roof giving way, the supports snapping, entire teams buried alive, their bodies recovered days later, if at all. Above ground, the miners were known by their grime. Their clothes were perpetually soiled, their faces lined before their time. They bathed in shared cold basins. They returned home in the dark, left again before dawn. Sleep was never deep, for the body never truly relaxed. Food was simple, bread, broth, sometimes meat. Life was a cycle of descent and exhaustion, and yet, despite all this, there was camaraderie. In the tunnels, men looked out for one another. They developed signals, songs, gestures to communicate in the dark. They shared tools, shared rations, shared grief. When a life was lost, the others mourned, not in ceremony, but in silence, in the way the work paused, even briefly. In 1842, the horrors of mine labor were exposed publicly. A parliamentary report revealed the conditions of underground work, especially for women and children. The public, previously unaware or indifferent, was shocked. Laws followed, banning women and children under a certain age from working below ground. But enforcement was inconsistent. In poorer regions, the practice continued, hidden, unspoken. Even today, the image of the miner remains heavy with symbolism. Not only for what they endured, but for what they represented, the raw, unseen labor behind the engines of progress. For every flickering street lamp, a boy once sat in darkness. For every train that ran on time, a girl once crawled through coal dust. For every factory that hummed, a woman once pushed a cart through heat and shadow. Now, as you lie in your own quiet, consider the silence of the mine, the absence of light, the weight of stone, the sound of breath, shallow, measured. These were the conditions of survival, not of choice. These were lives given to an earth that took more than it returned. Let their memory rest beside you now. Let their labor be honored not by repetition, but by remembrance. The coal has cooled, the tunnels have caved, but their endurance remains. Woven into the warmth of homes, the tracks of railways, the echo of history. And as we emerge from the depths, we carry them with us, step by step, into the next story. As you lie still in the quiet hush of night, your breath gentle and your thoughts softened by the rhythm of this journey, we turn now to an object that changed the course of countless lives. Not a person, not a law, but a machine, small in form, but vast in consequence, the spinning jenny. A name that seems almost delicate, Jenny, yet the change it ushered in was anything but gentle. It was swift, transformative, and for many, devastating. The spinning jenny was invented in the 1760s in the humble cottage workshop of James Hargreaves, a weaver in Lancashire. At first, it was a simple wooden frame, no larger than a tabletop, that allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at once. Previously, a spinning wheel required one person to tend a single thread. With the jenny, a single operator could manage 8 spools. Later models expanded to dozens. The time, the cost, the effort slashed dramatically. Hargreaves, like many inventors of his time, likely hoped to ease labor, to improve output, to support families like his own. But the machine took on a life beyond his intent. As its use spread, it became more than a tool. It became a dividing line between those who embraced the future and those left behind by it. Weavers and spinners, who had once worked slowly and with care from their homes, now found themselves obsolete. Their hands, once valued, were outpaced by wood and wheel. The textile industry, sensing the promise of profit, began to consolidate. Instead of scattered cottage industries, centralized factories arose. Machines like the spinning jenny were placed in long rows, operated by wage workers, often women and children, under strict supervision. The craft was gone. What remained was labor, efficient, tireless, interchangeable. In towns across the north of England, news of the jenny's arrival was met not with celebration, but with fear. Spinners gathered in secret, worried whispers turning into public unrest. In 1768, a crowd stormed Hargreaves's home and destroyed several of his machines. Others followed suit in neighboring towns. The machine was not merely technology, it was a symbol of lost stability, of vanishing independence, of the creeping transformation of life itself. Unemployment surged in regions dependent on hand spinning. Women who had earned modest but sustaining wages now begged for work. Men who had built reputations as skilled cloth workers watched as their tools fell silent. Entire households once supported by home-based industry were forced to seek factory work, uprooting lives, abandoning traditions, adjusting to the grinding cadence of the new economy. The change was not gradual, it was abrupt, and it was felt not only in coin purses, but in identity. A spinner was no longer a spinner, a weaver became a machine operator, time became segmented, movement became prescribed. Autonomy was replaced by instruction. In larger towns, the shift to mechanized production brought wealth for some. Factory owners, merchants, textile exporters, their profits soared, buildings expanded, chimneys multiplied. But beneath the promise of economic growth was a human cost. Families crammed into city tenements, surviving on lower wages, stripped of the dignity once found in making something with their own hands. There were those who adapted, who found new roles, who rose within the changing order. But many more were swept aside, their stories rarely recorded, their resistance reduced to a footnote, their grief dismissed as obstruction. Even today, the spinning jenny is celebrated in museums, textbooks, exhibitions. She stands as a marker of innovation, of the moment when productivity accelerated beyond previous limits. But less often do we speak of the mothers who folded their looms for the last time. The fathers who stood idle, watching their children enter factories. The generations who passed from craftsmanship to labor without pause, to mourn what was lost. Let your thoughts settle here, in this quiet moment. Let the image form of a wooden machine, humble, sitting in a cottage corner, of a man proud of his creation, of a woman nearby watching her thread lose its value, of children unknowingly stepping into a world forever altered. Progress in this story does not arrive with banners or celebration. It arrives quietly, with wooden arms spinning faster than hands ever could. It brings change, it brings power, but it also brings questions that still echo into our present. Who decides the cost of innovation? Who is asked to pay? Let that question drift with you now softly. We will return soon with more voices, more threads of this vast, tangled fabric we call history. But for now, let the stillness hold you. Let the whirring of the jenny fade into the background, like a lullaby remembered from long ago. Let the darkness around you feel gentle, not oppressive, as we enter one of the most iconic yet somber landscapes of the Industrial Revolution. A city not whispered about for its beauty or calm, but known, feared, respected, and endured for its smoke, its noise, its perpetual motion. Birmingham, the city of 1,000 trades, the city blackened. For many, Birmingham symbolized the triumph of industrial ingenuity. Here, factories did not simply rise, they multiplied. Foundries, forges, metalworks, workshops of every kind sprang up in every district. It was a place where the boundaries between home and work, between nature and machine, blurred into a single, overwhelming experience of industry. The name Birmingham did not suggest rest. It suggested labor, clamor, and soot. Imagine walking its streets in the early morning hours. There is no sunrise, not truly. The sky is a muted gray, thick with particles, even before the factories roar to life. Smoke does not drift lazily. It hangs, low and heavy, like a fog that never lifts. The bricks of the houses are not the red of raw clay, but the deep, dull brown of soot and cinders. Trees where they survive are leafless, even in spring. The windows are always slightly dirty. The air tastes of iron and fire. For the people who lived here, especially the working class, this was not a passing condition. It was the climate of life. The air entered their lungs with every breath, coating their throats, deepening their coughs, darkening their clothes. Coal smoke mixed with metallic fumes. At the height of its industrial activity, Birmingham's skyline was said to have been permanently cloaked in a haze of smoke, so thick that stars and sometimes even the sun were obscured. The smell was equally pervasive, acrid, chemical, pungent. Sulfur from smelting plants, burning oil from engines, ammonia from dye works. The scent of heat itself, not warmth, but fire made mechanical, constant, without pause. For many, especially children, the city's scent would become indistinguishable from the scent of home. Life in this atmosphere was shaped by constant exposure. Respiratory illnesses were not an anomaly, they were a norm. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis. The human body, already taxed by long hours and poor diet, was further eroded by every breath taken. And yet families lived here. Children played here. People fell in love here, celebrated, mourned, dreamed. Their existence was not one of constant complaint, but of constant endurance. What made Birmingham different was not only its scale of production, but its concentration. The sheer number of small, tightly packed workshops created a density of pollution that seeped into every crack of the city. These workshops operated at all hours, their chimneys always active, their furnaces always glowing. Night brought no silence. The pounding of hammers, the hiss of steam, the clank of wheels, they continued like a second heartbeat unceasing. Observers at the time described the city in nearly apocalyptic terms. Charles Dickens called it a place of smoke and confusion. Others, more sympathetic, called it the workshop of the world, but acknowledged the cost. Artists attempted to capture its skyline, often shrouded in deep tones of gray and ochre, its outlines blurred by smog. Even poetry, when it addressed Birmingham, spoke not of beauty, but of force, raw, relentless, transformative. Yet for all its darkness, the city also carried a strange kind of pride. This was a place of survival, of invention, of sheer human will harnessed to fire and metal. Its workers developed remarkable skills. Its neighborhoods were close-knit, even when compressed. And its people, though weary, carried the silent pride of those who keep something massive in motion, even at great personal cost. The children of Birmingham learned early to navigate its haze. They went to school with blackened hands, their nails never truly clean. Their games were played in alleys where soot fell like snow. Their imaginations, shaped by factories, often involved machines. A new toy might be fashioned from scrap. A lullaby might be interrupted by a steam whistle. For many women, daily life meant scrubbing black off surfaces that would never shine. The endless cycle of cleaning was a kind of quiet resistance, a way of preserving some dignity amid the grime. For men, survival was often about breath control, muscle memory, and silence. Few complained, few expected better. But some did speak, reformers, writers, doctors. They documented the city's ailments, mapped the correlation between factory zones and illness, pleaded for cleaner air, for regulations. Still, the industrial engine roared louder than their warnings for many decades. Today, much of that smoke has cleared. The factories have closed or moved. The sky over Birmingham is sometimes blue, but the legacy of those years remains, not only in stone and archive, but in the collective memory of hardship endured beneath darkened skies. Let the image of that city settle with you now, not as a place to fear, but as a place that held life despite it all. A city that breathed poison and still managed to dream. Its streets may have been dim, but its people carried their own light, however flickering. And as we drift onward, let that light accompany us into the next chapter, into the deeper layers of this long and gentle remembering. Let the quiet deepen around you and allow your thoughts to wander now toward the halls of law. towards slow footsteps echoing through marble corridors, and the rustle of parchment where words were finally written to try, even if only slightly, to temper the suffering born of industrial might. This is not the story of swift justice or sweeping reform. It is the story of hesitant acknowledgement, of early efforts to say, enough. By the early 19th century, the cost of industrialization was no longer possible to ignore. The evidence was too visible, too overwhelming. In the factories of Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and beyond, children worked long hours under brutal conditions. Women, fatigued by double burdens, collapsed at their looms. Men coughed their lives away in cotton-laden air, often without reaching old age. The cries for reform began to rise, not from the factory floors themselves, where silence was often enforced, but from outsiders who had seen and who refused to forget. One of the first such observers was Robert Peel, father to the later Prime Minister, who owned a textile mill himself. Moved by the appalling treatment of children, he introduced what would become the first of many factory acts, the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act in 1802. It was a small beginning, aimed mostly at the treatment of pauper children, those from orphanages and workhouses sent to labor in distant factories. The act required that apprentices be provided with clean clothing, some schooling, and a minimum level of sanitation. It also proposed a 12-hour working day, still long by modern standards, but less punishing than the 14 to 16 hours many endured. Yet even this modest law was barely enforced. Factory owners ignored it. Inspectors were not assigned. The law existed more as suggestion than command. Still, it was a beginning. Public awareness grew slowly, often through the work of reformers and writers. Parliamentary committees were formed. Testimonies were heard. Workers, especially children, shared their experiences with trembling hands and nervous voices. Their words painted a picture not only of hardship, but of abandonment, of being used, forgotten, and worn down by a system that saw only productivity, not pain. In 1819, another Factory Act was passed, prohibiting the employment of children under 9 in cotton mills and limiting work hours for those aged 9 to 16 to 12 hours per day. Again, enforcement was minimal. Again, factory owners pushed back, citing economic harm, job loss, and the need for competition. Still, the seed had been planted. Over the next decades, more laws followed, each one building slowly on the last. The Factory Act of 1833 marked a turning point. It established a system of paid inspectors, a small corps, underfunded and often resisted, but with the authority to enter factories and enforce the law. The act limited the working hours of children under 13 to 9 hours per day and required at least 2 hours of education during the workday. It was not enough, but it was the first real signal that the government might, at last, be willing to step into the shadows cast by industry. The act also recognized something new, that children were not simply small workers, they were people, developing, vulnerable, deserving of rest, of education, of care. It seems simple now, but at the time it was revolutionary. The 1844 and 1847 Acts expanded protections further. Women's hours were reduced, night work for children was banned. Dangerous machinery had to be enclosed. For the first time, there was recognition of the body as something not merely functional, but worth protecting. And yet, these laws came slowly, met with fierce resistance. Factory owners argued that regulation would destroy their businesses. They warned of lost profits, of foreign competition, of the collapse of the economy. Many believed, truly or cynically, that poverty itself was best managed through discipline and labor, not compassion. Even when laws passed, they were unevenly applied. Inspectors were few, bribes were common, Records were falsified. Children continued to lie about their age to earn wages. Women returned to work too soon after childbirth. Accidents remained frequent. And for many workers, the law felt distant, something written far away in the language of power, not of relief. Still, change was coming. It came not in waves, but in drips. With each new act, each reform, the industrial machine was asked, not forced, but asked to slow, to soften, to see. And over time, some did. Factories with better conditions attracted more stable workers. Communities organized to support reform. Churches, newspapers, and labor unions gave voice to those long unheard. A new moral language emerged, not just of profit and efficiency, but of fairness, of duty, of humanity. Tonight, as you rest, consider the slowness of this justice. How it came not like lightning, but like water wearing down stone. How each law was a small gesture toward mercy, shaped by countless unseen hands, those who testified, who suffered, who persisted. Let your breath rise and fall with that rhythm. Let the thought settle that change, even when slow, is still change. That progress, when driven by care, can endure longer than the engines it seeks to temper. We move forward now, deeper into the story. The laws were written. But the lives, they continued, one shift at a time, still caught between the gears. Let us follow them there, gently. Let your body sink deeper now, gently guided by breath and warmth, as we open a quieter, more tender chapter in this long unfolding night. Amid the cold machinery and relentless pursuit of profit that marked the Industrial Revolution, there was, remarkably, a softer voice, a figure who stood not against progress, but beside it, asking a different question. Not how much can we produce, but how well can we live? His name was Robert Owen, and his story is a reminder that even within systems of steel and smoke, compassion can grow. Owen was born in 1771 in Newtown, Wales. The son of a saddler, he showed early signs not only of intelligence, but of deep curiosity about the world and the people around him. By his late 20s, he had become a successful textile manufacturer in New Lanark, Scotland, an area already known for its mills powered by the River Clyde. But where others saw workers as tools, Owen saw individuals. Where others enforced silence, Owen asked questions. When he assumed control of the New Lanark mills, he inherited not just machines and buildings, but the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children. Many of them were pauper apprentices, orphans, or abandoned children sent to labor in the mills. The conditions, though not the worst, were still harsh. Hours were long. Discipline was strict. Education was minimal. The rhythm of the factory overrode everything else. Owen did not seek to destroy the system. He sought to reform it from within. He began by reducing the working hours, not drastically, but noticeably. He improved housing, simple changes at first, more ventilation, cleaner quarters, stronger roofs. He established a shop where workers could buy goods at fair prices, eliminating the exploitative practices of local merchants. But his most radical act was creating what he called the Institute for the Formation of Character, a school not just for children, but for adults as well. In this school, lessons included not only reading and arithmetic, but hygiene, cooperation, kindness. Music and dancing were encouraged. The walls were painted in soft colors. The atmosphere, unusual for the time, was one of dignity. Children learned without fear. Workers were seen not only as laborers, but as learners, thinkers, human beings. Owen believed deeply that environment shaped behavior. That people, if given decent conditions, fair treatment, and hope, would respond with honesty, effort, and loyalty. And for a time, his experiment worked. The New Lanark mills remained profitable. Worker turnover decreased, families grew stronger, visitors from across Europe came to witness what they called the model factory, but not everyone approved. Fellow industrialists scoffed at his idealism, they questioned his finances, they mocked his belief in universal education and shorter hours. And when Owen proposed even more ambitious reforms, abolishing child labor, creating cooperative communities where work and life were shared equally, many turned against him. He left New Lanark eventually, his vision clashing with the interests of his partners. But his ideas did not die. He traveled, lectured, wrote. In the 1820s, he attempted to build a utopian community in America, New Harmony, Indiana. It failed within a few years, torn by internal conflict and logistical flaws. But even in failure, it inspired others. Owen's belief in cooperation, education, and social responsibility planted seeds that would grow in unexpected soil. In the decades to come, his vision would influence labor movements, educational reform, and the early roots of socialism. His name became associated with a gentler industrialism, one in which factories did not crush, but could perhaps uplift. He was not perfect. He was paternalistic at times. His idealism could blind him to complexity. But he was rare, a man of power who chose to listen, to care, to try. And in an age when so many turned their backs on the suffering of the poor, Owen walked toward it. Tonight, let us pause with his memory, not to romanticize, but to remember that history is not made only by revolutionaries or tyrants. Sometimes it is shaped by those who build quietly, with patience, with hope. Sometimes progress is not measured in output, but in the light that enters a classroom window, in the smile of a child learning her first letters, in a worker returning home before dark. Let your breath match that rhythm now, slow, kind, human. The mills of New Lanark still stand today, and the river still runs beside them. A reminder that even amid the noise of industry, there was once a man who believed that kindness too could be revolutionary. We carry that kindness forward now, deeper into the night, toward the next story waiting to be heard. In the soft hush of night, as you lie still and the world outside quiets into deeper rest, we arrive now at a place built not of comfort, but of necessity. A place meant to shelter the poor, the old, the sick, the abandoned, but one that often resembled more a prison than a sanctuary. This is the story of the workhouse. To speak of the workhouse is to speak of the silent backbone of industrial society, those who fell between the cracks, those too old to labor, too young to survive alone, too sick to be hired, the unemployed, the widowed, the orphaned, the disabled, those who, in an age obsessed with production and progress, became invisible burdens in the eyes of the system. The workhouse was where they were sent, or where they went, when every other door had closed. The idea was not new. Even before the Industrial Revolution, English parishes were responsible for the care of the poor. But with the rapid urbanization and population booms of the 18th and 19th centuries, the traditional methods collapsed under the strain. Cities swelled with the displaced and the destitute. The fear among the ruling classes grew, not just fear of poverty, but of the poor themselves. So, in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed. Its purpose was simple and harsh, to make the workhouse the only option for relief. No more handouts, no more assistance outside the walls. If one sought help, they had to enter the workhouse, and to enter was to submit, to discipline, to separation, to shame. These institutions were designed intentionally to be unpleasant. The philosophy was that if conditions inside were too bearable, too warm, too generous, the poor might come willingly. And so, to discourage this, families were often split, husbands from wives, parents from children. Even siblings were assigned to different wards. They might catch glimpses of one another at chapel or in the yard, but contact was limited, voices kept low. Upon entry, personal belongings were taken, clothes replaced with uniforms, hair sometimes cut, schedules rigid, food bland and minimal, bread, gruel, thin soup, watery porridge. Work was assigned regardless of age or health. Stone breaking, oakum picking, laundry, cleaning, long hours, repetition, surveillance. The elderly often found themselves among the most vulnerable. No longer able to work, they were treated as dependents without value. Many who entered the workhouse in old age never left. They died in the same cold, narrow beds in which they had arrived, and their graves, when marked at all, bore only numbers. Children, too, filled these halls. Some were born inside, others brought in by desperate parents. Some arrived alone, found wandering streets, clutching a crust of bread or a bundle of rags. They were taught discipline above all else. Some learned to read, to sew, to scrub floors until their hands cracked. Play was rare. Laughter, rarer still. The mentally ill, the disabled, the pregnant, each group had its own corner, its own burden to bear. Medical care was minimal. Compassion depended on the staff, and kindness was often overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of those in need. Abuse was not rare. Neglect, even less so. And yet the workhouse was not only a place of suffering. For some, it was the only refuge from death by cold, hunger, exposure. It offered shelter, however stark, a bed, however hard, food, however meager. And occasionally, among the grimness, there were moments of gentleness, a nurse who softened her tone, a fellow inmate who shared their bread, a child who hummed a song in the dormitory dark. Visitors from outside often reacted with horror. Charles Dickens, who visited several workhouses and wrote vividly about them in his novels, helped bring public awareness to their conditions. The character of Oliver Twist, the orphan who dares to ask for more, was not merely fictional. He was drawn from the thousands of real children who lined up for gruel, who feared the matron's stick, who cried themselves to sleep under thin blankets. Throughout the 19th century, reformers pushed for change. Some workhouses introduced better sanitation. Others allowed families to stay together. But these improvements came slowly, inconsistently, and often only after public outrage. By the end of the century, the very idea of the workhouse had begun to falter, seen more as a relic of cruelty than a beacon of order. And yet, they remained. Into the 20th century, the buildings stood. Some were repurposed into hospitals, shelters, poorhouses under different names. Others were demolished, their histories buried with their bricks. Tonight, let us remember not the walls, but the people who passed through them, the mother who surrendered her child at the gates, the man who limped through the snow with nothing left but his name, the child who watched the world through barred windows, wondering what warmth might feel like. Their lives were not failures. They were survivors of a system that measured worth in coin, not in character. Let your breath move softly now, with their memory. The workhouse was not only a place, it was a shadow, cast by an era. But in that shadow, lives persisted, not with comfort, but with courage. And we carry their courage forward into the next part of our journey, still walking slowly, still listening. As your breath softens and the darkness becomes a familiar comfort, let us step now into the crowded alleyways and close quarters of the industrial city, where beneath the hum of machinery and the shouts of labor, another threat crept silently, unseen but not unfelt. It was not born of steam or smoke, but of something more ancient, disease. Epidemics swept through these new urban landscapes with a speed and cruelty shaped not by nature alone, but by negligence. In the 19th century, cities like Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, and London expanded rapidly, absorbing wave after wave of rural migrants. Houses rose overnight, packed side by side, often without foundations or drainage. Streets narrowed, privies overflowed. Wells were dug too close to waste pits. The promise of industrial prosperity grew on the surface, while beneath it, water turned foul and the air grew thick with contagion. These were the conditions in which disease found its perfect host. Cholera arrived in Britain in the early 1830s, its origins traced to the Ganges River in India, but carried westward through trade, ships, and empire. It struck hard, sudden, and mercilessly. A healthy adult could collapse in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The symptoms, violent vomiting, dehydration, a haunting blue pallor, terrified the public. Whole families were lost within days. Neighborhoods emptied of the living. The dead were carted away in silence. In the poorest quarters, where sewage trickled openly through the streets and families of 10 or more shared a single damp room, cholera moved fastest. Clean water was a rarity, soap a luxury, ventilation non-existent. It was in these places, where landlords profited from overcrowding and authorities turned blind eyes, that mortality soared. And cholera was not alone. Typhus, spread by lice in unwashed clothing and bedding, was a constant presence. So too was dysentery, tuberculosis, and smallpox. Children were especially vulnerable. Many did not survive their first year. Others were marked for life, scars on their skin, weakness in their lungs, stunted growth from persistent fevers. In one infamous episode, the Great Stink of 1858, the River Thames in London became so saturated with human waste that its odor forced Parliament to temporarily close. The heat of that summer amplified the smell, the sickness, the realization that something had to change. The miasma theory, then the prevailing belief that foul air caused illness, was beginning to give way to germ theory, thanks to the work of physicians like John Snow and Edwin Chadwick. John Snow's discovery was revolutionary in its quiet precision. In 1854, during a cholera outbreak in Soho, he mapped the locations of the ill and found a pattern centered around a single water pump on Broad Street. By removing the pump handle, he halted the spread. This simple act, turning off a faucet, became one of the earliest and most powerful demonstrations of public health intervention. But even as the science evolved, social attitudes lagged. The poor were still blamed for their own illness, labeled as unclean, irresponsible, morally weak. It was easier to shame the sufferer than to confront the squalor in which they were forced to live. Sanitation improvements came slowly. Laws were passed, inspections promised, drains laid, but for many, these changes arrived too late. Hospitals, when they existed, were sparse and overcrowded. Nurses were often untrained, supplies scarce. Home remedies abounded, herbs, poultices, whispered prayers. For those with no access to care, illness was endured in silence. Bodies weakened until they gave in, and death was met not with ceremony, but with quiet acceptance. And yet, there were moments of resilience. Community doctors who served despite risk, mothers who nursed children through fevers with only a damp cloth, neighbors who shared broth and blankets during outbreaks. These quiet acts of care did not stop the waves of disease, but they softened their impact. They reminded those suffering that they were still seen, still human. In time, reform did take root. Public health boards were formed. Cities began to understand that cleanliness was not a matter of charity, but of necessity. Sewers were built, water sources protected, hospitals improved, mortality rates declined slowly. But the scars of those earlier years remained, not only in records, but in memory. Tonight, let us pause in one of those narrow alleys where the walls lean close and the cobblestones are slick with recent rain. Imagine the footsteps of a nurse, her lantern glowing faintly, a father carrying a child too still, a neighbor leaving food at a sick woman's door knowing she may never open it. These are the stories behind the numbers, the faces behind the reports, the lives behind the reforms. Let their quiet suffering be remembered now, not with fear, but with reverence. Disease is not only a natural force, it is shaped by the choices of society. And when those choices ignore the vulnerable, the cost is borne not by the system, but by the bodies of the poor. Let your breath return to its rhythm, slow and steady. The night still holds many chapters. But for now, let us rest here, in recognition, in remembrance, in the hush of those who endured. As the stillness of the night deepens around you and your breath eases into a quieter rhythm, we enter now a space not made of coal or cloth, not a factory nor a tenement, but something more elusive, an idea, a belief, a faith born not in temples or cathedrals, but in the glowing forges and humming halls of the Industrial Revolution. It is here that the machine, once a simple tool, was raised slowly and deliberately to a higher place. It became more than metal. It became meaning. It became divine. To understand this transformation, we must begin with wonder. Imagine, for a moment, a world lit only by fire and moonlight. A world where human hands shaped nearly everything that existed, where tools were extensions of the body, and labor was guided by daylight, by season, by custom. Then suddenly, in just a few decades, machines appeared that could spin, weave, forge, cut, and assemble faster than any human ever could. Looms that never tired. Engines that moved without horses, presses that printed thoughts onto paper with breathtaking speed. It felt, to many, like magic. And where there is magic, worship is never far behind. The industrial age brought with it a new kind of reverence, less emotional perhaps, but no less devout. The machine, precise and tireless, offered what nature never could: control, predictability, efficiency. It answered the deepest fears of a society long ruled by chance, of failed harvests, of disease, of famine. In the machine, people saw not only hope, but deliverance. Soon, factories were built not merely for utility, but with grandeur. Tall ceilings, symmetrical layouts, chimneys like steeples, and in place of altars, rows upon rows of machinery. They moved in unison, with rhythm, with purpose. Workers entered not in procession, but in shifts. Still, the structure felt strangely sacred. And what of the people inside? They too were drawn into this new order. Time was no longer marked by sun and moon, but by whistles, by bells, by clocks nailed to walls. Every second measured, every pause noted. Punctuality was praised not only as practical, but as virtuous. Idleness condemned not as a luxury, but as a sin. The good worker, like the good worshiper, was obedient, consistent, silent. Even language began to change. The terms of faith, devotion, discipline, reward, punishment were repurposed. Manuals replaced scriptures. Factory codes substituted commandments. Progress was spoken of with the gravity once reserved for prophecy. The future was not mysterious, it was mechanized. The machine would carry us there smoothly, inevitably, with enough coal and calculation. This belief was powerful, and like all faiths, it had its rituals. Children were taught early to respect the machine. In schoolhouses, they learned arithmetic not for philosophy, but for accounting. Reading was for signs, instructions, orders. Silence was encouraged, movement restricted. The goal was not to imagine, but to obey, to prepare for the moment they would step into the factory, into their assigned role in the great, grinding order of things. Mothers adjusted to this rhythm with quiet resignation. Meals were timed to shifts, infants nursed between whistles. The home became an annex to the factory, structured around its demands. Fathers, often exhausted, measured their worth by output, by how many hours they worked, how many pieces they finished, how few breaks they took. And when workers failed to conform, when they slowed, when they sickened, when they questioned, they were cast out, replaced, dismissed. The machine did not forgive. It demanded constancy. Those who could not keep up were left behind, their value measured solely in productivity lost. Yet this cult of the machine was not limited to factories. It seeped into the very imagination of the age. Writers described industrial landscapes as majestic. Engineers became heroes. In homes, small machines began to appear. Clocks, sewing devices, kitchen tools, each one promising ease, order, betterment. People began to judge themselves not only by what they owned, but by how efficiently they lived. And religion, once separate, slowly bent to this new logic. Sermons praised work as salvation. Rest became conditional, earned, not given. Suffering was spiritualized. Even God, in some teachings, was imagined as a kind of ultimate designer, precise, orderly, unfailing. The sacredness of creation was echoed in the sacredness of construction. But beneath this glowing vision, cracks began to show. The machine did not heal the body. It broke it. It did not lift all boats. It lifted a few and drowned many. Its rhythm, once awe-inspiring, became exhausting. Workers dreamed not of transcendence, but of silence, of hours without noise, of days without numbers, of time that belonged to them again. Some resisted. Artists painted the factories not as cathedrals, but as prisons. Poets lamented the death of nature, the loss of mystery. Children, instead of praising the machine, learned to fear its bite. And slowly, questions rose like smoke. What do we lose when we worship function? What do we become when our value is measured only in speed? Even now, the legacy lingers. We check our clocks. We rush through days. We praise multitasking. We fear stillness. Somewhere deep in our cultural memory, the machine still whispers, move faster, do more, become useful. But tonight, in this moment, you do not need to obey. You can remember a different rhythm, one of breath, of rest, of stories told slowly in the dark. The machine is not a god. It is a tool, powerful, yes, but never sacred. The sacred, perhaps, lives elsewhere, in the softness of this hour, in the quiet persistence of your heart, in the stillness you allow yourself now. Let that stillness hold you. Let it whisper, not command. Let it remind you, you are not a machine. You were never meant to be. As the hush of the evening deepens and your breath slows into something quieter, more grounded, we enter a place where silence is not merely rare, it is absent. A space where noise becomes the air, where the ceaseless roar of industry drowns not only conversation, but the self. This is the factory floor, not imagined through the gleaming sketches of innovation, but as it was truly experienced. A world of sound without end, a world that shaped not only the body, but the mind. Let us listen for a moment, not with our ears, but with the heart. Imagine a vast room dim with soot and streaked with oil. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of machines whirring, grinding, thumping. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the drone of belts slicing through air, and beneath it all the steady pulsing rhythm of progress, measured in decibels, in vibrations that rattle the chest and wear down the soul. There was no escape from this sound. Workers were surrounded by it, hour after hour, day after day. There were no earplugs, no breaks for quiet, no refuge from the mechanical cacophony. People shouted to one another across looms and engines, mouths moving with no hope of being heard. Instructions were mimed, gestures sharpened by urgency. But mostly there was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the defeated kind, the kind that grows when speech is no longer possible. In textile mills, the spinning mules clicked and pounded in repetitive cycles. In metalworks, the hammering of forges echoed like thunder. In printing presses, gears churned without rest. This noise was not ambient, it was total. It filled the head, buzzed in the teeth, pressed into the bones. It was physical, it was intimate, and it did not stop when the shift ended. Long after leaving the floor, workers reported phantom sounds, machines still turning, still pounding, still shrieking inside their skulls. Sleep was broken, dreams invaded. Some described the noise following them home, into their kitchens, into their beds. Children raised near factories developed a tolerance for these sounds, but not immunity. Their play was punctuated by factory whistles, their lullabies overpowered by distant engines. But the effect was not only acoustic, it was psychological. The relentless din took a toll not easily measured. It created a state of constant alertness, a sharpening of nerves that never softened. Anxiety rose, tempers shortened, concentration shattered. In such environments, accidents were common not only because of poor conditions, but because of distraction, of stress, of sheer auditory fatigue. Mental health, a concept scarcely acknowledged at the time, suffered deeply. Workers began to show signs of what today we might recognize as trauma, exhaustion, emotional numbness, mood swings, dissociation. Depression was common, though rarely named. Suicides occurred, and yet the noise was never addressed. It was considered part of the job, part of the progress, part of what it meant to get ahead. Some tried to adapt. They sang while they worked, not to overcome the sound, but to create rhythm within it. They developed hand signals, routines, unspoken pacts of cooperation. They found comfort in small things, a shared look, a moment of stillness when a machine paused for maintenance. But mostly, they endured, quietly, desperately. And the silence around their suffering was not only literal, it was institutional. Factory owners did not measure noise, they measured output. There were no regulations, no thresholds, no warnings. A worker might go deaf within a few years. Another might begin to shake uncontrollably. These were not recorded. These were not seen. And yet, even in the midst of this mechanical uproar, people found ways to carry on. They held hands on breaks. They exchanged glances of solidarity. They wrote poems, sang songs, whispered prayers into the roar. They did not always understand what was happening to their minds, but they knew something was being taken, something soft, something precious. And still, they returned. Because there was rent to pay, mouths to feed, because they had no choice. The sound of the factory was not merely a physical force, it was a culture, a presence, a godless liturgy. And long after the Industrial Revolution faded, its echoes remained, in the hum of traffic, in the pressure to respond, to produce, to never stop. The internal noise that many feel today, that restlessness, that background buzz, it is not new, it is inherited. Tonight, in this quiet, let that inheritance loosen its grip. You are not in the factory now. There are no whistles here, no engines turning, only your breath, only the hush of remembering. Let the weight of that noise fall away. You do not need to shout above it. You do not need to endure it. Let silence return, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of space, of healing, of being heard. And with that gentleness, we continue. The night still holds more truths, more voices, more moments waiting to be brought back into the light, or into the dark, where they can finally rest. Let your body soften further now, your breath more measured, your thoughts free to wander through the quiet shadows of the past. And let us move gently into kitchens long vanished, into narrow tenements and factory canteens, into the fragile and often invisible world of working-class food. Because to understand how people survived the Industrial Revolution, we must also understand what and how they ate. Food, so central, so human, was never just sustenance. It was survival. It was routine. And in industrial cities, it was often a source of struggle, of disappointment, of hunger that gnawed not just at the belly, but at the spirit. Imagine a worker rising before dawn in a cramped room shared by 6, perhaps 8 others. The floorboards creak beneath tired feet. Outside, smoke drifts from factory chimneys. The air is cold. Breakfast, if there is one, is simple. Perhaps a slice of bread, a smear of dripping saved from yesterday's stew, or a cup of weak tea brewed from reused leaves. Some eat standing, others rush, still dressing, mindful of the factory whistle that will not wait. The day begins on this meager fuel. Children, too, rise early. Many go without food, their small stomachs tightening into silence. School, when available, offers no meals. Factories, even less. For those lucky enough to work in mills with meal breaks, food is brought from home. A crust wrapped in cloth, a boiled potato, a hard-boiled egg if the family had one to spare, no refrigeration, no variety, just what was available, what could be carried. At midday the hunger deepens. The body, already aching, demands more. But meals were rarely nourishing. Meat was a luxury, reserved for Sundays, if at all. Vegetables, when eaten, were often overcooked or old. Fresh fruit was expensive and uncommon. Bread, porridge, and potatoes formed the bulk of most diets. Fat was used sparingly, salt liberally. Sugar was both treat and temporary escape. For many, dinner was the only proper meal, if it could be called that. In single-room homes, families gathered around one pot. Stews were common, a base of water thickened with flour or oats, flavored with onion or leek, occasionally a bone for broth. The same stew might be eaten for days, altered only slightly. Some households kept scraps, bones, peels, and even animal fat collected from butcher's waste. Nothing was wasted, not because of thrift, but because of necessity. The labor these meals supported was immense. Long shifts on factory floors, in mines, in construction yards. Hours of physical exertion with minimal nutritional support. Malnutrition was not always dramatic. It was not always starvation. It was slower, subtle, a persistent weakening. Children failed to grow properly. Women lost hair, bled excessively, suffered miscarriages. Men grew thin despite hard labor. Teeth decayed. Bones weakened. Immune systems collapsed. Diseases like rickets, scurvy, and anemia flourished, diseases tied directly to diet. Doctors observed but often blamed character rather than circumstance. Laziness, some said. Poor hygiene, others claimed. Rarely did anyone look at the food and ask, is this enough? Is this fair? Canteens, when they existed in factories, were crude. Large rooms with long tables where workers sat shoulder to shoulder. The food was fast, bland, functional. Little thought was given to taste, to comfort. Breaks were short, conversations, hurried, no music, no warmth, just eating as necessity. And yet, in this bleak landscape of meals and missed meals, small moments of care still emerged. A mother who saved a bit of jam for her child's bread. A neighbor who shared broth during illness. A wife who rose early to boil oats so her husband wouldn't faint on the job. These were not grand gestures, they were daily ones. Quiet, determined acts of love in the face of scarcity. For children, food was often tied to memory. The rare plum at Christmas, the soft sweetness of treacle on bread, the smell of roasting chestnuts on a city corner. These moments became markers of joy in lives marked by exhaustion. Hunger sharpened their awareness, not just of lack, but of presence. A full stomach was a kind of grace, and food, even when scarce, brought people together. Communal meals, modest though they were, offered connection. In tenement courtyards, neighbors sometimes cooked over shared fires. Potatoes were passed hand to hand. Soup was ladled into borrowed bowls. And while the food itself may have been meager, the act of gathering, of feeding, and being fed offered something beyond calories. It offered dignity. Later in the 19th century, reformers began to notice. Nutritionists, doctors, and social critics started to document the link between diet and productivity, between hunger and health. Soup kitchens appeared, charitable food programs emerged, but the stigma remained. Accepting help was seen as weakness, and many continued to suffer quietly. Even today, echoes of that hunger remain. The pressure to eat quickly, the guilt around indulgence, the separation of food from joy. These are inheritances of an age that prized output over well-being. Where meals were rushed, where pleasure was suspect, where nourishment was reduced to necessity. But now, in this hour, there is no need to rush. Let your breath be your nourishment. Let your stillness be your satiety. Let your thoughts dwell, not on hunger, but on those who endured it, and on the small, tender ways they fed one another despite it. Food is never just food. It is memory. It is connection. It is survival. And in the quiet spaces where history lives, we can still taste the resilience of those who made do with less and gave more than they had. We move forward now with reverence, toward more stories, toward more voices. The table of the past is long, and there are still many seats to visit. Sink a little deeper now, as the night folds gently around your thoughts. Let us drift into another dimension of the Industrial Revolution, not made of soot or metal, but of numbers, of ticking hands, of invisible chains. This is the story of time, not as we once knew it, guided by sun and season, but of time measured, sliced, and governed by the relentless rhythm of the clock. Before the rise of the factories, life moved with the land. The day began at first light and ended with the dark. Work followed the harvest, the tides, the weather. There was variation, rest, unpredictability. Time belonged to the body and the world outside. A shepherd rose with the sheep. A weaver worked by daylight. A mother shaped her rhythm around the needs of her home. But as machines took root and chimneys rose into the sky, a new time emerged, a time that was not felt, but enforced. Factory time. Here the day began not with the sun, but with the whistle. Workers marched in, often before dawn, and did not leave until the whistle blew again. Breaks were scheduled, and strictly so. Every minute was watched. Arriving late meant losing wages. Leaving early meant punishment. Time cards were introduced. Bells rang in unison with machines, and behind it all, the clock, a cold circular authority, ruled without mercy. For the industrial worker, time became fragmented. Life was no longer a flow. It was a grid: work time, meal time, rest time, sleep time, repeat. The body no longer determined the schedule determined the body. Fatigue had no voice, illness no excuse. The clock ticked forward, and so must everyone else. This shift was more than logistical, it was psychological. People began to internalize the clock. Even outside the factory, they watched it. Meals were eaten quickly, walks became brisk, conversation shortened. Leisure, once spontaneous, became a luxury. The slow rhythm of storytelling, of music, of sitting together on stoops and porches began to fade. Children were taught punctuality not as a courtesy, but as survival. Schools rang bells. Churches timed sermons. The home, once ruled by intuition, became an annex of the workplace. And what of those who could not conform? The elderly, the sick, the differently abled, anyone who could not keep pace, were seen as inefficient, unproductive, their worth questioned, their time inconvenient. In a world run by machines, the human clock, full of pauses, unpredictability, needs, was no longer trusted. People apologized for being tired, for being late, for being slow. The new religion of time did not offer grace, only guilt. Even dreams changed. Rest, once a right, became something earned. Workers collapsed into bed not with peace, but with a sense of failure if the day's labor was not enough. Many dreamed of clocks, of missing bells, of running endlessly. These were not just dreams. They were echoes of a system that invaded even the sanctity of sleep. Yet amid this tyranny, moments of resistance glimmered. Some slowed down on purpose, stretched lunch by a minute, stopped to watch the sky, told stories when they could, found a bench and sat for no reason but to sit. These small pauses were revolutionary. They reclaimed time not as currency, but as life. Poets mourned the loss of natural time. Artists painted scenes of stillness. Philosophers wrote about the cost of living by numbers. And workers, in whispers, remembered Sundays before the factory, when the world was slower and the hours belonged to them. Over time, labor movements began to demand shorter hours, the 10-hour day, the 8-hour day, weekends. Holidays, time off, not just for rest, but for reclaiming something essential, something stolen. They marched not only for wages, but for the right to breathe, to sit, to hold their children without counting minutes, to bathe without rush, to sleep without guilt. The demand was not simply for fewer hours, it was for more life. Some employers resisted, arguing that every lost hour was lost money. Others mocked the idea that leisure had value. But the workers held firm. They formed unions. They held strikes. They endured firings, threats, hunger, all in the name of reclaiming their own time. And slowly, change came. Laws were passed. Factory hours reduced. Breaks mandated. Time, once a whip, began to soften. But the memory of its tyranny remained. In the body's exhaustion, in the anxiety of lateness, in the strange discomfort many still feel in silence, in stillness. Even now we measure ourselves by productivity. We rush meals, apologize for naps, turn rest into reward rather than necessity. The clock may no longer hang in the factory, but it lives in our minds, in our hearts. But here, tonight, there is no clock. Let the hour drift. Let your breath guide you, not the ticking hands. You are not late. You are not behind. You are exactly where you should be. Rest, not just your body, but your relationship with time. And as the quiet deepens, we continue. Not by the measure of seconds, but by memory, not by urgency, but by care. There are still more chapters to unfold, and we will meet them slowly, gently, in the rhythm of the night. Let the silence stretch softly now, as we follow the path not into the factory floor, but into the classroom. A space that, during the Industrial Revolution, became less a sanctuary of learning and more a corridor leading straight into labor. This is the story of education reshaped, not to nourish wonder or foster freedom, but to mold obedience. To prepare children not for life, but for work. Before the machines began to dominate the cities, learning was often intimate, irregular, and personal. Children were taught at home or in small parish schools, with lessons interwoven into daily life. Reading the Bible, counting sheep, writing letters. Some never learned at all, and others learned from the stories of elders, from the songs sung at dusk, from the patterns in the soil. It was a slower education, but one linked to meaning, to rhythm, to the world outside the window. But with the rise of factories and urban labor, a new child was needed, a child who could sit still, follow rules, perform tasks in repetition, and above all, respect the clock. Schools became preparation sites, small uniforms, straight lines, timed lessons, bells not unlike those of the mills. The curriculum narrowed, less poetry, more arithmetic, less curiosity, more conformity. Children were not asked what they thought, they were told what they must know. Obedience became the highest virtue, and punishment, too, reflected the industrial ethos for talking out of turn, the cane, for tardiness, public shame, for poor handwriting, extra drills. The classroom became a mirror of the factory floor, desks in rows like workbenches. The teacher, a foreman of thought. Learning was not discovery, it was discipline. Children as young as 5 sat for hours on hard benches, memorizing facts, reciting texts by rote. There was no room for daydreams, for questions, for boredom. Silence was demanded. Even recess was regulated. The goal was not to grow thinkers, but to train workers, to mold bodies and minds into cogs ready to fit into the machine. And still, the factory waited. Many children did not finish school. By age 8 or 10, they were already spinning thread or shoveling coal. The school had done its job. It had made them ready to follow, to endure, to produce. The lines they had practiced copying became the lines they stood in. The bells that shaped their lessons now marked their labor. Some reformers, to be fair, dreamed of something more. There were teachers who read poems aloud, who let children draw, who planted gardens in schoolyards and taught the stars. There were moments of rebellion, of softness, a shared loaf of bread at lunch, a lesson held outdoors, a smile between tasks. But these were exceptions. The rule was rigidity. And behind that rigidity was fear, not of the child, but of what would happen if the child did not fit in, did not conform, did not obey. For the working-class child, education was both a promise and a cage. It promised upward mobility, a better life, a way out. But the bars of that cage were built from the same steel as the factory gates. To be educated was not to be free. It was to be prepared for another kind of confinement. Girls were often taught separately. Their education focused on domestic service, sewing, manners, restraint. They learned to serve, to smile, to wait. Their future was imagined not in offices or libraries, but in kitchens and nurseries. Boys were taught strength, discipline, usefulness. Girls, silence. And yet, even within these walls, the human spirit stirred. A boy who dreamed of writing. A girl who asked too many questions. A teacher who smuggled Shakespeare between math lessons. These quiet acts of resistance mattered. They reminded the child there is more. There is always more. And today, when we think of school as a place of growth, of potential, we still carry shadows of that old design. The bell still rings. Desks still line up. Tests still measure repetition. And time, once again, slices the day into manageable, measurable portions. The question remains, do we teach children to think or to comply? Let that question linger as the night holds you. Let it not disturb you, but accompany you, as a candle flickers beside memory. You are not in that classroom now. There are no bells here, no rules, no lessons but the gentle unfolding of truth. We continue unhurried into the next chamber of the past, where more voices wait, where more echoes reside, where the clock no longer dictates, and the mind may finally roam free. Let your body grow still now, a soft anchor in the gentle dark. The noise of the factory has quieted, the classroom echoes have faded. We now enter a space where the machine is no longer only external but internalized, where the human being, once sacred, once poetic, is reduced to a system of parts, a tool, a mechanism. This chapter belongs to the body, to its labor, to its wear. In the heart of the Industrial Revolution, the human body was not honored. It was measured, calculated, shaped to serve the rhythm of production. Arms were valued for their reach, fingers for their dexterity, backs for their strength, lungs for their capacity, each part considered in isolation, like a gear within a clock. The worker was no longer a soul, but a body, and the body was no longer whole. It was a set of functions. Productivity became anatomy. And pain? Pain was inefficiency. In factory reports, workers were reduced to numbers. Hands, they were called, not men, not women, just hands. As if they existed solely to grasp, to lift, to pull. Accidents were not tragedies. They were disruptions. A lost finger, a crushed foot. These were calculated as downtime, as replacement cost. And the injured were often discarded. If a man could no longer walk, he no longer worked. If a child's vision failed from strain, they were no longer useful. There were no pensions, no protections. The body was not mourned. It was replaced. Even language began to mirror this dehumanization. People spoke of manpower, output, efficiency. They spoke of breakdowns, of repairs, not of fatigue, of sorrow, of grief. To complain was to malfunction, to rest, to fail. And yet these bodies endured, bent from lifting, burned from forges, stiff from sewing. Their skin bore the marks of labor, the calluses, the scars, the ingrained soot. Their posture changed. Their hands trembled. Their joints swelled. They aged before their time. But inside these mechanized shells lived stillness, longing, thought, a yearning not to be cogs, but people. Some workers resisted not with words, but with presence. They sang as they worked. They decorated their machines with flowers, with pictures, with names. They created rituals, small human moments within the inhuman cycle of the factory. And others wrote diaries, poems, letters. One seamstress wrote of her aching spine and still described the sunlight on her window. A miner wrote of darkness, but also of the songs he sang while walking home. These voices remind us the machine may shape the body, but not always the soul. Still, the cost was immense. Women miscarried from fumes. Children developed deformities from posture, from pressure, from poor nutrition. Men died not only of accidents, but of exhaustion. The average life expectancy for many urban laborers was shockingly low. The body was pushed, punished, ignored. Medical science, too, mirrored this view. Doctors studied the worker as they might a steam engine. How many hours could the body endure? How could fatigue be minimized? How could workers be made more efficient? Few asked, what do they feel? What do they need? And so, slowly, this vision of the human body as machine crept into culture. Even today, we speak of ourselves in mechanical terms. We burn out, we crash, we power through, we measure our days in productivity, our worth in output. We forget to pause, to feel, to be. But you are not a machine. You are breath, pulse, memory, emotion. You are the ache and the rest, the pause between efforts, the sigh at the end of a long day. And tonight, you may reclaim your softness. Let your joints be free. Let your breath slow. Let your heartbeat be enough. The machine has no place here. You are whole. You are not parts. You are not production. And as we continue into the gentle folds of history, we carry this truth with us. The body is sacred, even when the world forgets, even when the factory demands. There are still more voices to hear, more shadows to walk through. But for now, let the silence hold your tired limbs. And know, you are more than useful. You are human. As the night deepens and stillness surrounds your resting body, we move quietly into another overlooked corner of the Industrial Revolution, a space where silence was not the absence of voice, but the denial of it. This is the story of women working, enduring, surviving, and of how their labor was both essential and invisible. In the shadows of the factories and behind the smoke-stained windows of textile mills, countless women bent over machines. They spun thread, stitched garments, packed goods. Their fingers bled, their backs ached, their eyes strained in dim light, yet their presence in history is often faint, their stories diluted. Women were not an exception in industrial labor, they were the foundation. Factories relied on their nimble hands and their willingness, sometimes coerced, sometimes chosen, to work for less, for longer, with fewer protections. Wages for women were drastically lower than those for men, often half or even a third. The justification was cruelly simple. They were not considered providers, only supplements, and so their labor was valued less, even when it equaled or surpassed that of their male counterparts. Their days began before the sun and ended well after its setting. For many, there was no choice. Widows, unmarried women, wives of men too ill or absent to provide. The factory offered a wage, however meager. It offered purpose, escape, or mere survival, but it also brought hardship. The double burden was immense. After grueling shifts, women returned home not to rest, but to unpaid labor, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, tending to husbands or elderly parents. The work never ended. And yet society praised them not for their strength, but for their silence. Respectable femininity in the eyes of the time was domestic, quiet, supportive. The working woman disrupted this ideal. She was often judged, criticized, or simply ignored. Her sweat did not shine. Her calloused hands were not heroic. Her exhaustion was deemed natural. And in the crowded dormitories and factory towns, women faced more than fatigue. Harassment was rampant. Supervision was harsh. Privacy was scarce. Young girls, some no older than 12, were vulnerable, targeted not only by the system, but by those within it. And when they were violated, society often blamed them. There were also moments of community. Women looked out for one another. They shared food, stories, remedies. They braided each other's hair. They laughed when they could. In rooms heavy with noise, they found ways to communicate through gestures, glances, murmured songs. This sisterhood was a balm, a quiet defiance. In some cities, women organized. They formed early unions, led protests, demanded better conditions. One such moment occurred in 1834 when female textile workers in Lowell, Massachusetts, staged one of the first strikes by women in U.S. history. Their voices, often muted, rose in unison. Yet the road was long and change was slow. Few laws protected women. Fewer acknowledged the complexity of their lives. And the narratives of industrial progress continued to highlight men, the inventors, the owners, the reformers, while the women remained unnamed, anonymous, essential, forgotten. Still, they persisted. Their resilience was not loud but steady. It flowed in quiet mornings and weary footsteps, in lullabies, sung after shifts. They carved space where there was none. They built homes from exhaustion. They stitched dignity into seams no one saw. Even now, echoes remain. Women continue to be underpaid, overworked, and overlooked in many sectors. The structures built in the age of industry, of inequality, of silence, still linger. But so too does the legacy of endurance, of strength hidden in plain sight. Tonight, let us honor them, not with applause, but with attention, with presence. Let your breath carry the memory of a girl hunched over a loom, of a mother stirring porridge after midnight, of a sister walking alone in the early dark. Let their invisibility become visibility. And in this quiet moment, as you drift further into rest, Know that your body, however tired, however unseen, is worthy, is real. We move forward now, gently, toward more lives, toward more truths. The night continues, and with it, the soft telling of stories too long ignored. Settle even deeper now, as the hush of night cradles your breath. Let us step softly into one of the most sorrowful corners of the industrial age, a space where childhood, so often thought of as sacred, playful, and protected, was instead reshaped by machines and soot, by hunger and obligation. This is the story of the stolen childhoods, the children who became laborers, who became numbers, who became silent cogs in a system too vast to see them. They were 6, sometimes 5, occasionally 4, their hands still pudgy with baby fat. Their eyes too large for their faces, they did not run through fields or build forts of blankets. They did not daydream without consequence. They woke before the sun, climbed from shared straw mattresses, and walked barefoot through muddy streets to factory doors. They were chosen not for their strength, but for their size, for their smallness, for their malleability. Children could fit between machines, beneath looms, inside shafts where grown bodies could not go. They could be taught discipline quickly. They could be frightened into obedience. They required less pay. They asked for little. And so the system embraced them. In textile mills, they cleaned and untangled threads that spun faster than eyes could follow. In coal mines, they worked as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors for hours in the dark, with only rats and cold air as company. In chimneys, small boys climbed with brushes, scraping soot until their skin tore. Girls sorted ores, hauled water, stitched seams until their fingers cracked and bled. The hours were long, 12, sometimes 14. Breaks were rare, meals minimal. Fatigue was punished, not pitied. A child who slowed down was whipped. A child who cried was ignored. A child who collapsed was carried out and replaced. There were injuries, countless and cruel, scalped heads caught in spinning wheels, crushed limbs, burned faces. Some survived broken, others did not. And yet the world looked away. Society rationalized, claimed that work built character, that children from poor families needed to contribute, that idleness was dangerous, that hunger was more cruel than labor. And so the children endured. They did not speak of dreams, only of aches, of fear, of longing. Many did not know how to read, had never touched a toy, had never seen the sky in daylight. But still within them the ember of childhood flickered. In moments stolen between shifts, they played. Chalk drawings on factory walls, pebble games in alleyways, songs whispered in stairwells. A doll made from rags, a carved figure from coal. These were acts of resistance, not loud, but sacred. They reminded the world, if only briefly, that children still lived inside those laboring bodies. Some adults saw them. A few reformers documented their suffering. Writers exposed their stories. Painters depicted their exhaustion. Laws were proposed slowly. The 10 Hours Act, the Factory Acts. But enforcement was weak, and industry was relentless. For every child saved, dozens remained. The loss was more than physical. It was emotional, psychological. Many grew into adulthood not knowing how to play, how to rest, how to feel safe. Their childhoods did not anchor them. They haunted them. And some, broken in youth, never recovered. Today, echoes persist. Though laws now protect many, child labor has not vanished. In fields, in sweatshops, in hidden factories, in digital corners. It wears new faces, but the same logic persists. The smallest among us can be bent the furthest. And so tonight, we hold space for them. Let your heart reach back to a small hand gripping a broom, to a soft voice swallowed by machine noise, to a child who never knew the quiet of bedtime stories, but only the roar of industry. Let that memory soften your breath. Let it deepen your stillness. You are not a machine, and neither were they. Their stories live on, not in textbooks, but in memory, in the hush of night, in the care we now give to rest, to tenderness, to silence. We will continue gently. The path ahead is long, but every step remembers someone who walked it before, with bare feet and a weary heart. As the stillness of the night deepens and the quiet air rests softly around you, we now enter a solemn chapter of our journey, one that winds through cathedrals and factories, through prayer books and payrolls, through the uneasy intersection of heaven and industry. This is the story of how religion, which for many had once been a haven of comfort and guidance, was slowly entwined with systems of exploitation during the Industrial Revolution. A story of faith, not lost, but redirected. Not silenced, but manipulated. For centuries, religion had served as a moral compass for communities. Churches were not only places of worship, but also of gathering, consolation, and memory. Bells called people to reflection. Candles flickered beside whispered hopes. Scripture was read in homes where bread was shared, where the seasons and the sacred flowed together. But as the landscape of life shifted, fields giving way to factories, hearths to chimneys, silence to the roar of machines, faith did not stand apart. It was drawn in, absorbed, reframed to suit a new order that valued obedience over mystery, structure over spirit. In towns swollen with laborers and mills, factory owners often funded chapels. They installed pews and preachers not out of charity alone, but out of need. Religion became a tool, a means to control, to pacify, to justify. Sermons shifted subtly. The emphasis moved from compassion to discipline, from grace to gratitude for one station, no matter how bleak. The poor were told their suffering was divine preparation, that hardship was a test of character, that endurance would be rewarded in another life. Blessed are the poor in spirit, echoed through stone halls where exhausted bodies knelt. Children, barely rested from their last shift, were taught to fold their hands in prayer. God gives us work to make us good. Women with raw fingers from stitching garments were encouraged to see their toil as service. A virtuous woman labors without complaint. Men coughing from coal dust were told that patience was a virtue, that their fatigue mirrored that of Christ carrying the cross. And yet, there was no resurrection promised in this life, no Sabbath from hunger. Many factory owners saw themselves as benevolent. They gave to charity, donated hymnals, built orphanages. But rarely did they raise wages, rarely did they reduce hours. Their generosity, though public, rarely pierced the daily suffering of those they employed. Some ministers, hand-picked and salaried by these owners, reinforced these views. They preached loyalty, submission, temperance. Do not covet the life of others, they warned. Accept your lot and be faithful. Rebellion, they hinted, was rebellion against divine order, but not all clergy complied. There were voices, soft, insistent, that spoke from within the tradition but against its misuse. These were ministers who walked with the workers, who buried their children, who saw the hollowness of sermons written for the rich. They quoted not only Paul but the prophets, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, they asked. These dissenting voices were often silenced, dismissed, or reassigned, but they persisted in secret house meetings, in letters smuggled through networks of labor reform, in songs that blended prayer with protest, and outside the churches, new movements stirred. Some workers turned to alternative spiritualities, to mysticism, to folk traditions remembered from rural pasts. They lit candles to ancestors, sang in dialects forgotten by liturgy. Others turned away from religion altogether, worn down by the weight of its betrayal. Still, for many, faith remained a flickering light. Not because of what the sermon said, but in spite of them. In the quiet act of lighting a candle after a shift, in the whispered prayer for a sick child, in the memory of a mother's lullaby, half hymn, half comfort. Faith was not always institutional. It was breath, a rhythm, a way to survive. But the damage was done. Religion, once a sanctuary, became a scaffold. It propped up the factory walls. It soothed the consciences of those who profited. It dulled the unrest of those who suffered. And in doing so, it lost something sacred. Today we still carry traces of this alignment. The linking of labor to virtue, of wealth to morality, the idea that rest must be earned, that struggle is noble, that silence is holy. But tonight, in this moment, we listen differently. We listen to the gospel of breath, to the sermon of softness, to the sacredness of your rest. You are not made holy by your labor. You are not purified by your pain. You are worthy now, in stillness, in slowness, in sleep. And as we move forward, let us carry with us not only the critique of what was distorted, but the hope of what can be reclaimed. A faith that heals, that liberates, that sees every tired hand, every bowed head, every broken dream, and whispers not endure, but rest. More voices await us, more shadows to walk through. But here in the candlelight of memory, we pause, we breathe, we remember. And then, gently, we continue. In the still and hushed hours of the night, when the world outside is silent and your breathing softens, we now approach a different kind of voice. A voice not spoken, but painted, etched, written. The voice of art. A voice that did not clamor like machines, but whispered, screamed, mourned through brushstrokes, lines, and melodies. This is the story of how, amidst the soot and steel of the Industrial Revolution, art became testimony. Art became protest. Art became a way to see what society refused to. Even as the official narratives praised progress, artists turned their eyes to the margins, to the hunched figures on the factory floor, to the thin children with hollow eyes, to the grim landscapes of towns swallowed by smoke. In literature, novelists like Charles Dickens emerged as quiet revolutionaries. He wrote of children crushed by poverty, of bureaucracies more inhuman than machines, of love twisted by survival. Oliver Twist, Hard Times, David Copperfield. These were not just stories, they were mirrors. They showed the middle classes the parts of society they preferred not to see. He made visible the invisible. Poets, too, responded. William Blake, decades before, had already glimpsed the coming storm. In his dark lyrical Songs of Innocence and of Experience, he gave voice to the child chimney sweep, to the angel with a tear-streaked face. And because I am happy, and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, he wrote, piercing through the polite fictions of moral society. Painters took up the call. Gustave Doré's engravings, harrowing and intricate, captured the sprawl of industrial cities, streets choked with smoke, mothers cradling babies beneath broken roofs, workers slumped in exhaustion. There was no romance in these images, only truth. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in England turned to lush color and medieval themes, but within their folds lay critique, a longing for a world before the machine. Their work, both escapist and accusatory, stood as quiet defiance. And there were the anonymous voices, the folk ballads sung by workers, the crude drawings on tenement walls, the whispered rhymes passed between children in dormitories. These were not preserved in museums, but they lived, they moved, they consoled, they resisted. Art, in all its forms, bore witness. It allowed pain to be named, it allowed injustice to be felt, not as a statistic, but as a human wound. And in doing so, it invited the viewer, the reader, the listener to care, to pause, to see. But not all welcomed this. Critics often dismissed these works as exaggerated, dangerous, sentimental. Some artists were censored, others were shunned. But they continued, because art, when true, must speak, even softly, even at risk. In industrial societies where efficiency ruled and emotion was suspect, art preserved what was human. It reminded a child laborer that their sorrow mattered. It reminded a factory worker that they were more than hands. It reminded a weary mother that beauty still existed, even in hardship. And today, we are surrounded by their legacy. When we read an old novel and feel a tear rise, when we look at a grainy photograph of a soot-streaked face and feel our chest tighten, when we hear a lullaby and wonder who first sang it, and to whom, these are echoes of that era, and they still speak. Let them speak now, in this moment of rest. Let your eyes, though closed, see what they saw. Let your breath move with their brush strokes. Let your silence honor their courage. Art does not fix what was broken, but it does hold it. It cradles it. It refuses to forget. And in the forgetting, we lose something vital. Tonight we remember not only the artists, but those they painted. Not only the stories, but those who lived them. We remember the tender defiance of beauty born in bleakness, the soft rebellion of a song. The night continues. There are still truths to unfold, but for now, let the images gather like dreams behind your eyes. Let them rest with you. Let them remind you, you are not alone. Others have seen, others have felt, and still they created. Now, as the quiet of the night deepens and the rhythm of your breath softens like waves against the shore, we open a chapter not of revolution, but of slow, deliberate change, of ink on paper, of meetings behind closed doors, of voices raised not in protest, but in proposals. This is the story of labor legislation during the Industrial Revolution, of its victories, its failures, and its quiet, grinding hope. In the early decades of industrial expansion, there were no laws to protect the worker. No boundaries for hours worked, no standards for safety. The factory floor was a domain of unchecked power. Employers set the rules, and the poor obeyed them. Children worked from before sunrise until well past sunset. Women gave birth, returned to work days later. Men labored with injuries, through illness, with no expectation of support. There were no days off, no compensation, no structure, but the will of those in charge. But slowly, voices began to gather. Some were from within Parliament. Others were doctors, reformers, clergy, even a few enlightened industrialists. They visited the factories, saw the bruises, the bent backs, the bandaged fingers. They heard the coughing in coal towns, the weeping behind schoolhouse walls, and they wrote reports, letters, petitions, documenting what they saw with language meant to stir conscience, but also to persuade those in power. The Factory Act of 1833 was among the first. It limited the hours children could work, at least in theory. No child under 9 was to be employed. Those aged 9 to 13 were capped at 9 hours a day. But enforcement was sparse. Inspectors were few, fines were low, loopholes abounded. Later acts followed: the 10 Hours Act of 1847, the Mines Act, the Employers' Liability Act, each a step, a concession, each a compromise between human dignity and industrial appetite. But progress was not linear. Many employers resisted. They argued these laws would hurt the economy. That they interfered with free enterprise, that families needed the income. Some forged documents, lied about ages, worked children at night out of sight. And so legislation moved like a tired walker, sometimes forward, sometimes in place, sometimes backwards, but always propelled by those who would not let the suffering be ignored. Workers, too, organized. Unions emerged, not as modern powerhouses, but as fragile gatherings in pub back rooms. Their demands were simple: shorter hours, safer conditions, fair pay. Their meetings were sometimes illegal, their leaders imprisoned, yet the laws began to change. By the late 1800s, the idea of the 8-hour workday was gaining traction. Safety standards were debated. Compensation for accidents became a matter of public concern. The state, once indifferent, began to acknowledge its role, not as master, but as mediator. Still, limitations persisted. Many laws favored men. Women remained underprotected. Migrant laborers were often excluded. Enforcement relied on local authorities, many of whom sided with business. And most reforms required tragedy, massive fires, collapsed mines, dead children, for momentum. Yet the shift had begun. The very idea that work could be governed by ethics, that profit must be weighed against well-being, that a worker was not just labor, but life. This was a quiet revolution of its own, and it was not only about rules. It was about language, the emergence of words like rights, protection, welfare, the transformation of the worker from a tool to a citizen. Tonight, let us rest with that legacy. It is imperfect, it is unfinished, but it was carved from suffering, from solidarity, from hope stitched into hours. As your eyelids grow heavier, know that each pause you take was once unimaginable. That sleep itself, once stolen by shifts and whistles, has become a right. And that somewhere, someone once dreamed of this moment for you. The night stretches on. The journey nears its end. But first, let us take one more step, one more chapter, into the present that still echoes with the past. As the night deepens toward its quietest hour, and your breath slows with the rhythm of rest, we arrive at our final chapter, a space where past and present meet in shadow. The machinery may have quieted, the chimneys crumbled, the soot washed away. But the logic of the Industrial Revolution still hums beneath the skin of our modern world. Look around, even now. In cities lit long past sundown, in warehouses and office towers, in the screens that flicker at your fingertips, there are echoes of those first factories. Their rhythm lives in algorithms, their urgency in deadlines, their hierarchy in digital platforms, where the powerful remain unseen and the laboring unnamed. The exploitation did not vanish, it evolved. In many countries, children still work, not in textile mills, but in agriculture, in mines, in informal economies. They harvest cocoa, stitch footballs, mine rare earth minerals for our electronics. Their fingers, too small, still reach into machines. Their dreams still shrunk by necessity, and the global supply chain, so efficient, so modern, often hides conditions not far removed from the 19th century. Sweatshops, overcrowded dormitories, wages too low to eat, hours too long to sleep. The faces change, the continents change, but the logic remains: produce more, pay less, conceal the rest. Even in the wealthiest nations, the pressure of productivity persists. We glorify hustle, we reward exhaustion, we wear sleeplessness like a badge. The clock still governs us just as it governed the factory floor. The expectation to perform, to optimize, to never pause. These are old ideas in new language, and technology, once seen as liberation, often brings new burdens. We are connected always, reachable always, working always. The same tool that enables freedom also extends the workday into night. Emails after dinner, meetings across time zones, deadlines that ignore circadian rhythms. The machine may be quieter now, but its presence is constant. We also carry silently the emotional legacy, the sense of worth tied to productivity, the guilt of rest, the fear of being replaced. The loneliness of those outside the system, those deemed unproductive, unprofitable, unworthy. These are not personal flaws. They are inherited wounds, passed down through generations trained to believe that value equals output. And yet, amid all this, there are voices that remember, movements for slower living, for ethical production, for recognition of invisible labor, of caregiving, of rest, of healing. People reclaiming time, reclaiming body, reclaiming breath. The lesson of the Industrial Revolution is not only one of critique, it is one of recognition, of remembering that progress comes at a price, and that we must decide with care who pays it. Perhaps as you lie here tonight, you feel some of these echoes in your own life. The weariness that doesn't fade, the pressure to be more, the silence that feels too heavy. If so, know this: you are not alone. You are part of a long unseen lineage of people who worked too hard, who rested too little, who asked too late. But tonight you ask now, and that is enough. Let this final chapter be not only a reflection, but a release, a quiet loosening of what the past has pressed upon the present. You need not carry all of it forward. Breathe in. Let the factories fall silent. Let the machines grow still. Let the children sleep. Let the mothers rest. Let the workers sit down. Breathe out. The world will keep turning, but tonight it can turn without you for a while. You have earned your peace. And with that, we close the book, not on the story, but on the telling. The echoes remain. But for now, let them be soft. Let them be far. Let them become the hush that rocks you gently to sleep. And now, dear listener, as the journey reaches its final breath and the threads of time pull softly back into shadow, we arrive at the quiet threshold where history becomes reflection, where facts become feelings, where the roar of machines fades into memory, and what remains is the silence of choices, of costs, of human lives lived beneath the weight of progress. The Industrial Revolution reshaped the world. It gave rise to wonders, light in the night, steel beneath the sea, bridges that spanned continents, factories that fed cities. But each gleaming marvel cast a shadow. And within those shadows, we found the real stories, the forgotten ones, the weary ones. Behind every new invention stood a child who slept too little, a woman whose hands bore the weight of two worlds, a man who aged too quickly, bodies bent, dreams postponed, silences kept. Progress was never free. It demanded hours and years. It consumed forests, rivers, skies. It fed on hope. It declared itself triumph, even as it turned faces gray with coal and tears. And yet, even in this, humanity persisted. We saw it in the worker's song, in the mother's embrace, in the boy who carved a toy from scraps, in the woman who taught letters by candlelight, in the whispers shared behind looms, in the paintings smuggled from truth, in the laws proposed again and again until someone listened. This history is not a judgment. It is a mirror. It does not say, "Look what they did." It asks gently, what do we do now? What values guide us when we innovate? Who benefits from what we build? Who pays? As you prepare to sleep, perhaps your mind still holds the images: the child in the mill, the woman at the sewing table, the worker beneath the earth. Let them rest beside you, not as burdens, but as companions. They remind us that every society has its foundation, and that foundation must be more than stone or steam. It must be care, memory, humanity. Progress, if it is to mean anything, must include those who are usually left behind. Tonight, let your breath slow into peace. Let the past soften. Let the noise settle. You are here, safe, warm, not forgotten. Let the final words drift gently through your thoughts like falling ash. Quiet, gray, and glowing. Have a peaceful night. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, I'd be grateful if you gave a quiet click on the like button and subscribed for more winding journeys through the captivating and complicated annals of history. Until next time, sweet dreams.